Alarm clock. My lips moved in the private darkness behind the metallic bone rampart of my squid skull mask, forming the words once again. Accurate pronunciation, clear meaning, without adornment. I gazed upward at the gigantic soap bubble membrane as I spoke, watching the surface swirl with spirals inside spirals, liquid and smooth like oil gliding across water. Toxic purple light poured from the oily sphere, like a blazing fire of biological heat. My eyes and hands and scalp all itched like crazy, as if I was covered in sea lice. Vast white snake forms slithered over each other inside the bubble. That knot of otherworldly flesh was all that remained of Hringwindla, a living god who had once filled this barren cavity at the heart of his shell. Alarm clock, I whispered once more, then bit my lower lip. Alarm clock, Sevens echoed from beside me, her own voice so much more precise and formal. But no amount of precision or detail would help me with this task. Sevens could have spelled the words forward and backward, recited the etymology of the term and the entire history of alarm clocks. Or she could have called Evelyn and Nicole up here so we could play a trio of mobile phone alarm noises. None of it would help. Alarm clock was just words, not the thing itself. The words had no relation to the thing except for those of us who used language, and a specific language, too. Did Hringwindla speak English, except through Amanda? Did he even speak? I shook my head, my confidence draining as I waded through miles of swamp. Sevens, I don't think I can do this, I said. What am I supposed to do here, summon a giant alarm clock? I forced an awkward laugh behind my mask. If you like, said Sevens. I suppose I could always spin my tentacles together and bob through the air, like one of those novelty alarm clocks you have to catch to turn it off. Exceptionally cute, kitten. But no. I sighed. You could rise to my bait on occasion, you know that. Rain would. Rain would tell you that signifier and signified cannot be. Yes, yes, I know what Rain would say. She would start talking a lot of philosophy that goes over my head. Besides, neither signifier nor signified is relevant here. Somehow I doubt that making a loud enough racket is actually going to wake him up, or drag him out of the nightmare, or whatever it is we're trying to do. In the corner of my eye, 7 shades of stressful pedagogy nodded her head in graceful surrender. Alarm clock, I huffed, trying to steel myself. I kept scratching at my hands. My cuticles itched. Heather. Evelyn called in a very silly stage whisper from behind us, from the relative shelter next to the ancient church, along with Nicole. Heather, what are you two doing? Is it not obvious? Sevens replied. No. You're just staring at it. Keep us in the loop, for pity's sake. We're building an alarm clock, I called back to her. Then cast a look upward at the slowly orbiting halo of bubble servitors. Would too much noise bring them crashing down on our heads? Let me concentrate, please, Evie. The eye's lessons lurked in the deepest parts of my subconscious, the parts one preferred not to examine too closely. I used to think of that as a series of back rooms, cobwebbed and lightless, full of stalking monsters eager to jump out at me and drag me off into the dark. But over the last 9 months of my increasingly confusing and dangerous life, that metaphor had become useless. It wasn't applicable anymore, not when I reached down there so often to drag those lessons forth, to put them to my own uses. Nowadays the eye's teachings were more like infernal machinery, stored in a lake of toxic black oil to stop their reactive nature from running out of control when exposed to light and air. And when I was willing to burn my hands and forearms with caustic chemicals, I could use that machinery to perform miracles. But the eye had taught me only the principles, the mathematics which described the angles of an alien yet universal physics. Light, heat, kinetic force, these were all simple things. Gravity, nuclear attraction, magnetism. Even the act of sliding matter through the membrane between here and outside was just another kind of force, in the end. If I was willing to endure pain and risk permanent damage, I could put a lance of energy right through Hringwindla's body, no matter how big he was. That would certainly wake him up, as would 1,000 slightly less violent solutions. But none of those were an alarm clock. I'd made a beacon for Evelyn earlier, to guide her out of the house maze, and I hadn't even thought about that. But a beacon was just light, turned to the purpose of guidance. My body had an analog for the concept, in the rainbow strobing of my tentacles. And an alarm clock was just sound, turned to the purpose of waking somebody up. Something clicked into place in my thoughts. I didn't need an alarm clock, I only needed Hringewindla to wake up. Sevens, I murmured, trying not to break my concentration even as I asked the essential question, still staring up at the god bubble before us. What happens to the others back at the house, if we wake him up? Nothing, I think. You think? I resisted the urge to turn and look at her. I had to hold on to this concept. The nightmare will not end until we extract the parasite and kill it. The parasite is the one projecting the confusion. I think. Again, you think. I am not an expert on outsiders. She paused. That would be you, my dearest. I sighed and tried to ignore the clenched fist in my belly. I'm hardly an expert. My father would probably disagree. As would I. Well, thank you for the vote of confidence. I tried not to sound too sarcastic. I think I'm ready. Ready as I'll ever be. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. I'm going to try something. It might not work, I have no idea what the result will be. Do you need to step back? Do you wish me to do so? Unable to summon the words, I stuck out my hand, clammy with the fear of pain and failure. Sevens took my hand in hers. We stepped back together, away from the line of red paint. Nice and safe. I didn't do anything so cheesy or obvious as give us a countdown, but Sevens could probably tell I was about to dive by the way I took 3 short, sharp, nervous breaths. And then I plunged in, face first, full body, and falling, down into the vat of black oil where I kept the things I did not want to know. It would not be enough to simply locate the correct lessons from the eye and put them together in the right order to achieve a desired effect. Even dragging Sarika from the eye's grasp had been a matter of motion and force, even if I'd had to leave my body to attain enough leverage to perform the equation. But this equation was not brute strength, not a giant gulp of cold waters, no deluge of information overwhelming my tiny ape brain. This was delicacy and dexterity. I had to swim through the waters of the sump, like cave diving in pitch darkness, surrounded by sharp rocks and jagged steel, with the toxic gunk and the burning acids, to forge a human concept from the mathematics of the gods. I had to use the abyssal logic of starshine and electron mass to build an alarm clock. My last coherent thought before the pain was that perhaps the eye had intended this all along. Perhaps this was the point. The pupil must learn to apply herself. My brain was on fire from the first figure of the equation, white hot and melting through my neurons, but I couldn't just slam the pieces into place like with every other hyperdimensional equation. I had to stop and examine each one, select the next piece from the depths and fit it together, then turn the shape over in my mind to see if it looked right. Like building a real clock, with springs and winder and hands. For some absurd, subconscious reason, I clung to the memory of an egg timer that my mother had possessed when I was little, shaped like a rooster about to crow. Once, feeling mischievous, Maisie and I had set it to 60 seconds, then peered over the kitchen counter with nervous anticipation, waiting for it to ring out and irritate our parents. I rebuilt that little egg timer, piece by piece, from repurposed infernal machinery. Extrapolating from first principles took seconds. That doesn't sound like long, but at the speed of thought that may as well have been hours. I think I screamed. I know I squeezed Seven's hand hard enough to hurt her, grinding her fingers together. Lucky it wasn't Evelyn who'd offered to hold my hand through this messy and imperfect delivery, because I could have hurt her badly, broken a finger or dislocated her wrist. But Seven's was made of sterner stuff. My 6 tentacles flailed, slapping the ground. The equation building process went on so long that I felt blood start to drip down my face. A final piece burned and hissed in my hands, melting my flesh and turning it black. A tiny hammer to ring the bell, to waken. I screamed myself raw with a sound like a beached dolphin as I slid it into place. An angel was born. In the open space halfway between me and Hringewindla's dome, a 12-foot-high golden rooster burst into reality, like a sudden flare of molten gold dust. The center of its body was a giant clock. He crowed so loud that he exploded. The only evidence that I hadn't hallucinated the entire thing was a small, news of the weird article a few days later, in one of the local Sherriford newspapers. Every domestic and farm rooster between Manchester and the Pennines had all screamed their tiny little lungs raw in unison, at about 4:15 in the afternoon that day, for no discernible reason. Some of them had gone on for almost an hour, wearing themselves to exhaustion in an effort to see off some invisible challenger. Farmers irritated, locals baffled. Enthusiasts of the paranormal pointed to a Civil War battle that had taken place on this very same day, in the year 1643, in a field not too far from the south end of Sherriford. Roundhead ghosts are a better explanation than squid girls summoning giant imaginary egg timers, so I've never made an attempt to correct them. My abdominal bioreactor flared to life as the squid rooster exploded into nothingness. I crumpled and banged my knees on the ground, struggling to stay standing even as the reactor worked overtime to hold me up and keep me conscious. The delicacy of that brain math had taken every ounce of concentration and intellectual power I could muster. My head was stuffed with cotton wool. I wanted to stop thinking and stare at a wall for 12 hours. Sevens held my entire forearm, just to keep me from landing on my own face. "I'm all right," I tried to say, but my lips slurred the words and my mouth tasted like blood. My eyes were thick and gummy, tears running down my cheeks. My head hurt like a band of iron was expanding inside my skull. My stomach tried to punch its way up my throat and out of my mouth, but something stopped it, held it back, kept it in place. I was physically incapable of vomiting into the squid mask. I reminded myself to thank the donor, somehow, one day. Sevens was saying something, a low purr of congratulation, calling me a good girl. Stomping footsteps hurried to join us. Another voice floated from behind, perhaps saying my name, maybe scolding me, I couldn't be sure. My ears still rang with that rooster's crow. And then a wet slorumph filled the air. It was like the sound of an entire sewer system being unblocked with clean sea water all at once, or perhaps a power-generating dam being switched on for the first time and sluicing its internal machinery with muddy silt. I raised my eyes from the surface of the shell. Hringewindla was awake. A trio of those vast snake-like shapes breached the inside of the oil-on-water membrane, punching through from inside like sensory tendrils reaching out from the confines of a shell. Blunt-ended, covered in glistening, glinting, glittering scales, millions of tiny points of light reflecting the purple illumination. Each one must have been as thick as a skyscraper. And all three lashed toward me, crumpled and cowering on the ground. In that exact same moment, the halo of bubble servitors gathered and swirled downward, like a tornado forming in a stormy sky. I raised a hand, pure instinct and panic, my bruised mind spinning together the familiar old equation. Out! Out, all of you out! But then something made of black armor plate and white flesh grabbed my hand in a gentle claw. Hastur's daughter towered over me, shrieking and wailing up at the awakened god. Yellow spores covered her back in a cloak of deadly promise. Hands tipped with black razor blades made right-angle signs with each other, rotating back and forth in some unknowable symbolism. 7 shades of war and ruin stood over me like a bodyguard. And on my other side, a familiar drag thump of foot and walking stick heralded a crackle in the air. A discharge of static electricity rippled out across the shell surface and terminated in a visible bubble of blue-on-blue that seared my eyes like living fire, surrounding myself and Sevens with a 10-foot bubble of our own. Evelyn stood next to me, hands contorted into painful angles on the surface of her scrimshawed bone wand, sweating buckets and gasping out a torrent of jumbled Latin. Preem had both arms around her waist, holding her up. In the corner of my eye, I spotted Nicole too, still sheltering in the cover provided by the ancient church. She'd gone white as chalk. Marmite had joined her, cowering behind her legs. Nicole had her pepper spray out, held aloft in one shaking hand. Sevens was hissing and screeching up at the giant descending tentacles. Evelyn was almost panting her Latin chant, but she couldn't resist darting a terrified look at 7 shades of spikes and blades. I lurched to my feet, spread my tentacles wide, and hissed. Cringewindla hesitated. The trio of vast snake tentacles halted in their descent, whipping outward with sheer muscular momentum. A wave of displaced air buffeted down on us like storm winds, pulling at my hair and plastering my hoodie against my body. The whirling thread of bubble servitors slowed, circling and bobbing, but not yet returning to their halo formation. We were mad to think that a line of red paint on the ground could ever hold back something that large. "Do not try to speak," Preem said, clear as ever. Sevens made a sound up toward Cringewindla too, a bit like the sound a crab might make if it was losing a game of chess and decided to flip the board. She clacked several claws and did a skirts-to-tip muscular strain, as if threatening to release something from within herself. I didn't understand a word of it, but the intention was clear enough. "No, no," I croaked, groping to brace myself against the floor with my tentacles so I didn't fall over again. "He's just trying to smash his alarm clock. Woke up cranky." 7 shades of chitin iron turned her bulb-tip head toward me. At least I assumed it was a head, what with the various void black eyes and razor-sharp mouthparts surrounded by armor plates. "He's terrified of you," she said in a voice like the god of all wasps. "We need to talk to him," I croaked. I had to clear my throat, tasting mucus and iron, eyes itching and sticky with my own blood beneath the squid skull mask. Cringewindla's vast white tentacles floated hundreds of meters above our heads. My abyssal instinct bridged the gap of species and nature and time, reading his body language in those giant feelers. Fear and shock, held back for only a brief moment by our barely credible threat display. "He doesn't know why we're here, he's confused. We're talking to him," Evelyn tried to say, but then coughed and wheezed like she was having an asthma attack. Her hands held the bone wand in a death grip, refusing to halt the spell. "Talking to him," she wheezed out, "right now. We're not here to hurt you." I yelled up at the giant purple soap bubble, waving my hands in the air. "You've been infected by a parasite." The 3 vast snake tentacles pulled upward, retreating to gain momentum, to smash us to paste. 7 screeched like a banshee crossed with a hornet. Evelyn whimpered in pain. Even between their doubled threat, I doubted they could hold back the fist of a god. "He doesn't communicate with language," I murmured inside my mask. "He doesn't even have ears." Oh, damn it all, Lozzie would know how to talk to a god. What would she do? Lozzie wouldn't be afraid. Lozzie would make contact, with open arms and a joyous heart. I raised my voice so the others could hear. "I have to let him into my head." "What?" Evelyn choked on the word. "Kitten," Sevens warned me, a sound I did not care to hear again from this particular mask. Her voice made my bowels shiver. "He doesn't even understand what we are," I said. I took the first step toward the line of red paint and the edge of Evelyn's protective bubble. "He doesn't get it, he has no eyes to see, no ears to hear. We have to make contact." "Wait, wait." Evelyn snapped. She somehow found the reserves of energy to strain forward in Preem's grip. "Heather, no. I can do that better than you can. I've had demons in my head before, remember? Let me." "Denied," said Preem. Above us, Cringewindla's tentacles twitched, as if eager for our defenses to fail. We were some horrible irritant or infection, not meant to be here inside his shell. To be repulsed, like others before. He didn't recognize us. I turned back to look Evelyn in the eyes. My tentacles worked like extra feet, pulling me toward the boundary, to where I would be exposed to the outsider god. "Evie, I can't. What if he doesn't leave your head afterwards?" I can't risk that. What if he doesn't leave your head, Heather? I can force him out, I said, almost laughing with the absurdity of the statement. That would be easy. I'm the Eye's adopted daughter, remember? I can do anything to my own body. Anything. Heather, Evelyn said my name like it was a desperate curse. But forcing him out of you? I hiccuped, loudly, but I wasn't sure why. I can't do brain surgery on you like I did with Badger. Evie, I can't risk hurting you. I can't. I can do this but I can't do that. Evelyn started at me, eyes bulging, panting with the effort of maintaining her spell, relying entirely on Preem to stop her collapsing. She looked more openly distraught than I'd ever seen her before. Evelyn was a woman of surly, self-directed disdain, even in her darkest moments, not naked horror as I saw now. Preem, stop her. Stop her. I cannot drop you, said Preem. Evelyn glanced at Sevens, all 8 feet of towering war machine, and found half her courage again. Say something, you useless B-movie rubber monster. 7 shades of scary silicone turned her array of glistening black eyes on Evelyn, then on me, then ceased to be. She vanished without a flicker, like dropping the rubber monster suit and stepping out of the remains. The yellow princess stood there instead, umbrella tip against the floor, face calm and unreadable. Heather is correct, she said. Cringe-Windla lacks the means for communication. This is not coffee with my father. Far up in the air, Cringe-Windla's tentacles jerked, 100,000 tons of smooth mollusk muscle trying to decide if now was the time to crush us flat. Evelyn flinched and gritted her teeth, knuckles going white on her bone wand. I staggered sideways toward the crackling blue surface of Evelyn's protective spell, supported more by my tentacles than my shaking knees, unwilling to turn away from Evie's vulnerable, naked fear. Evie, it's going to work, it's going to be fine. The request made little sense, but I didn't hesitate. With my tentacles occupied in keeping me standing, I pulled the squid skull mask off my face with shaking hands, then sniffed back the blood dripping from my nose. I must have looked an awful mess after the brain math, with my own blood smeared around my eyes and dripping off my chin, mucus and snot all down my face. Evelyn stared at me, eyes scrunched with more than physical pain. Cringe-Windla's oil bubble cast purple light on her horrified face. Vast tentacles bunched and coiled. Bubble servitors descended in a slow, spiraling wave. Evie opened her mouth but she couldn't find the words, even with Preem holding her tight. She thought I was about to leave. Heather, I know, I said, croaking through the blood and mucus in my throat, smiling for her. Evie, I know. I know. And I'm not going to stop being me. I promise. This will be nothing. We were out of time. Above us, Cringe-Windla's skyscraper-thick tendrils reared up like a nest of cobras about to strike. I lurched toward the edge of the electric blue bubble, finally turning my attention away from Evelyn. Static electricity crackled across my clothes and tingled on my skin. I shouldered my way through Evelyn's spell. The bubble offered no resistance, then collapsed behind me as Evelyn screamed with frustration and gave up, hands finally slipping from the bone wand. She said something to my back, something she couldn't say to my face, something that made Sevens turn and stare at her with surprise, right at the limit of the princess mask's emotional range. But a boom of displaced air drowned out Evelyn's words. Cringe-Windla's tentacles cracked like thunder and raced toward me like meteoric buckshot. I was exhausted beyond thought, despite the bioreactor working overtime in my abdomen, like a sweat-shedding infection in my gut. Between the revelations and duels this morning, the emergency of Nicole's mysterious appearance, the absurd and spooky house, and the descent into Cringe-Windla's shell, I was about ready to crawl into bed and cuddle in Rain's arms and stop thinking for the rest of the month. So I lurched over the painted red line and stopped with my arms wide open. Cringe-Windla stopped too. His tentacles drifted to a halt. The bubble servitors floated, aimless and uneasy. I held my tentacles wide too, as many of them as I could spare without falling over. Inside, I was shaking with adrenaline as my gamble paid off. I was right, the red line wasn't the danger line at all. Cringe-Windla could likely reach into every nook and cranny of his shellcore with those vast appendages. The red line indicated how to commune with him. How to get close enough to whisper hello. One of the 3 giant tentacles split off from the other 2 and descended toward me, but gently and slowly this time, pushing displaced air down against me like a slow rolling storm. I held my ground, but had to grit my teeth to keep from screaming or hissing or scrambling back. Instinctive fear made me want to cower and hide at the approach of the largest limb I'd ever seen. Cringe-Windla dipped his tentacle, down and down and down, until a wall of white, scaled flesh drew level with me, only a few feet away. Right, I whispered, hoarse and frozen. Hello. Okay, so, how do we do this? How do we do this? I already knew, even as I asked the question. I stretched out one of my own tentacles, a final concession to caution and reluctance, not to use my own right hand, and touched the very tip of rainbow-strobing pneumosomatic flesh against Cringe-Windla's scaly hide. An intrusion, probing, slick and wet and wriggling, like an injection of living fluid flowing back up my tentacle and into my core of true flesh. My abyssal immune system gathered itself to repel the invader, assembling macrophage and tetrodotoxin, flooding my veins with white blood cells and raging up my spinal column in a red-hot flash sweat of internal fire. But I clamped down on the reaction, forcing control rods back into the reactor. I pulled my tentacle away from Cringe-Windla's touch, like I'd grasped bare metal in a snowstorm, but the intrusion was not severed. It was inside me now, wriggling upward, seeking contact. Shaking, shivering, gasping in the throes of a fever, with a black liquid slug inching up my brain stem, mouthparts feeling along the surface of my hindbrain for a way inside. A wave of terrible disgust and sickness rocked me. I wanted to vomit, purge my body, get this thing out of me. But this was what I wanted, wasn't it? There was no choice. If I couldn't talk with Cringe-Windla, then what hope did I have of communicating with the eye? I opened the gate of my mind and let him inside. The moment of transition was like dunking my head in a bucket of cold coffee. I felt something ooze across my cranial membrane and settle into the wrinkles of my brain, filling the creases like oil. Suddenly I was wide awake and panting, my heart racing, my skin tingling all over. I smelled alien pheromones, but then my nose filled with the scent of fresh-cut grass and dandelions, a forest glade in spring. I tasted strong tea and lemon cake, felt an enclosing warmth around my shoulders and on the small of my back, and imagined a whispered welcome on the edge of my hearing. Oh, that's weird, I panted. Is that you? Hello, yes, nice to meet you. I think. A question suggested itself, as if I was listening in on somebody else's subconscious. It wasn't words, just a jumble of sense impression and deep curiosity. Heather Morel, I said out loud, though I doubted it was necessary to speak my answer. You know me, we've met enough times. The slug oil in my brain slid deeper, soaking into the tissues and staining the gray matter. I retched and almost lost the contents of my stomach, but then suddenly the disgust vanished like a lifting fog. A feeling like a warm blanket settled on my shoulders, tucked itself in around my neck, and took my hands, patting them with papery, dry reassurance. My eyelids drifted shut. I felt completely and utterly safe, like I'd wandered out of the woods on a dark night and found a little old cottage, with a crackling fire and a single occupant, welcoming me to this oasis in the endless dark. All in return for whatever tales I could spare of the lands beyond the woods. Warmth, safety, and acceptance, a glowing wave of rightness, of knowing that something more powerful and much older than me was offering me protection and purpose, unlike any I'd ever known before. No human being could have resisted that opiate. I wasn't really a human being anymore. Abyssal instinct screeched and hissed and thrashed. I forced my eyes open and wide, like I was trying to avoid nodding off. Excuse me. I snapped, shrugging and waving my hands to force the imaginary blanket off my shoulders. No, I'm not here for that. I'm not one of yours. Stop it. Gentle now, rest your feet, sit down by the fire. I want to hear all about you, please, dear. I know you little people out there love to talk about yourselves. Those aren't my thoughts. I shouted. They are now, and that's okay, isn't it? I'm a lot bigger than you, but I won't blot you out. I wouldn't learn anything new if I blotted you out and sat on you and ate you up, so that's not what I do anymore, I promise. Just stay and talk, please stay and talk. Here, I've got coffee with spices, and more cake, and we can put on reruns of Home and Away. Or do you prefer cartoons? SpongeBob is a favorite of mine. Stop it. I snapped, hissing the words. I'm going to assume those are Amanda's tastes, and I'm not Amanda, I am Heather Morel. I am the adopted daughter of the Eye and soon-to-be daughter-in-law to the King in Yellow. You are in my head on sufferance. The strange thoughts went quiet. Quiet and sad, like a little withered old man standing there with a full teapot, confused about why I didn't want to have a drink with him. That image sharpened, as my mind took over again and interpreted what it could from the jumble of information spewing forth from the connection with Rinjwindla. A little old man, hobbling about his cabin in the woods with his crutches, wearing leg braces to keep himself mobile. But vital and full of energy. I can etch the surface of reality with my mind, I went on, softer now. I am a master of hyperdimensional mathematics. I can send your physical body outside with ease. So, don't make me do that, please. The old man went quite still. The brain slug was still nestled in my cranium. I turned away from the massive scaled tendril and back toward the others. Sevens looked calm and unruffled. Evelyn was slumped against Preem's side, staring at me in mute horror. Preem didn't seem too worried. Further behind them, Nicole was watching me with a deep frown, still pale and covered in cold sweat, utterly uncomprehending. Marmite crouched at her feet. Evie, I'm fine. It's me. I'm fine. I said, stumbling back toward my friends, almost tripping with my tentacles. Evelyn lurched out of Preem's arms before I could reach her. She let her walking stick clatter to the ground and grabbed my face with both hands, staring into my eyes with a piercing scowl. I had to catch her with my tentacles to stop her from falling over. Evie. It's you, she hissed, hoarse and raw. It's you all right. All right. Of course it's me, Evie. I'm fine. I've had worse in my head for my whole life. Evelyn sniffed deeply and wiped her face on her sleeve. Suddenly she couldn't meet my eyes, watching the floor and then gesturing at Preem to help her once again. Greetings, said Sevens. Good afternoon. She was speaking in my direction, but it took me a moment to realize she was not talking to me. He says hello, I replied. I think. It's not words, it's just a jumbled impression of stuff. We are not here on a social call, Sevens went on. We are solving a crisis. I did my best to stand up straight, even if she wasn't talking to me exactly. We had to be formal now, sensible, businesslike, at least that's what I told myself, the wrapper I used to process this increasingly absurd situation. Preem took Evelyn's weight from me as Evelyn fussed about with her walking stick. Nicole slowly approached us as well. He doesn't understand. I said slowly, trying to sort through vague impressions. I think. He just wants to sit around with us, hear about us. I shook my head inside. He doesn't understand any of this. No, he's in my head. For now. Nicole boggled at me. Like with Amanda? Not quite the same. More like I've broken into his house to interrogate him. The little old man in my mind hobbled to a chair and eased himself down, hands shaking in his lap, confused and afraid, at least, that's what it felt like, the closest my human sense impressions could approximate. I sighed again and glanced over at the gigantic purple bubble with the roiling snake monster inside, partly to remind myself of what we were actually dealing with here. Stop trying to be so pitiful. You were about to crush us to death. Why is it always tentacles? Nicole sighed. Outside has carcinization too, Evelyn grunted. You good, Morel? Nicole asked. What's it feel like? Like being invited for tea, I answered without thinking, then shook my head. Never mind. You have a medical condition, Preem said, clear like a silver bell. Windla sat up and paid attention to that. He stirred inside my mind, a sudden innocent attention behind rheumy old eyes. We are here to deworm you, Preem explained. That was apparently the wrong thing to say. The vast white tendril of scaled flesh that had descended for me to make contact with now began to lift from the ground, as if unsure. Wait. Evelyn snapped, stamping once with her walking stick. All her horror and dismay was gone, or at least crammed inside where she didn't have to examine it for a while. She still leaned on Preem's arm for support, but she straightened her spine as much as she could, and raised her chin. She did not address me, but spoke to the soap bubble and snakes of Windla's physical form. Now you listen to me, she hissed, simmering with anger. And listen good. Because if you're going to use Heather's ears to hear, then you better bloody well be paying attention. Evie, I whispered. There's no need for aggression. I have no love lost for you, you thing, she carried on, ignoring me. So believe me, I would not be here if this was not a very serious emergency. And when we're done, if you don't leave Heather's mind again, I will have your entire cult slaughtered, then come back down here with fire and acid until you're gone. Do you understand me? Evelyn took a shuddering breath and turned to me, swallowing down a burning anger that she could not hide. Heather, does he understand? Actually, I don't think he does, I murmured. He's already terrified of me in the first place. Huh, Evelyn grunted. He'll still have me to answer to. Yes, I think he understands that part, a little. Evelyn turned back to the soap bubble. You have a parasite, outsider. You caught it from Amanda Hopton, who caught it from Nicole here, who caught it from well, we don't know where from. Not yet. But I have my suspicions. Calmly but sharply, Evelyn explained what we knew about the parasite, the information scrambler. She recounted what had happened back in the house, from our human-level perspective. She related what had happened to the physical parasite inside Sevens, and the fact that Amanda and others were very likely still infected. As she spoke, I felt the brain slug ooze thing shifting inside my skull, a kind of pneumosomatic parasite itself, a link back to the vast creature that sat in front of us. The nightmare exists because of the parasite inside you, Evelyn said. It has jumped the species gap, hijacked whatever higher dimensional nonsense you're capable of, and is now running wild. We have to get it out of you. Yes, I echoed softly. I couldn't tell what Windla was thinking, he had gone very quiet inside my mind, like a placid pool of black water. We need to get it out, somehow. But my mouth had gone dry and my hands were shaking inside the front pocket of my hoodie. Windla was not anything like what I had expected when we decided to venture down here. Reaching into Seven's throat to remove a physical parasite was one thing, but this? Windla was simply too large, unless I was prepared to step inside his soap bubble membrane, like some kind of miniature medical robot inside a giant body. Brain math was an option, but the last time I had attempted to comprehend an outsider god via direct brain math, I plunged into the abyss with the sheer effort. I did have anchors now, but if Windla was even a fraction as complex as the eye, it might be too much of a risk. And how big was his parasite, anyway? Evelyn finished explaining and looked over at me. Does he comprehend? I don't know. He's gone rather quiet. Evelyn frowned harder, clenching her jaw. Pretty shocking, Nicole said with a forced casual tone. I mean, being told you've got a parasite. I'd be pretty freaked out if a doctor told me I had a tapeworm, you know. Evelyn rolled her eyes. Windla, I said out loud, voicing my thoughts. I'm not sure how I'm going to get this thing out of you. I do want to help. I don't know what trying to share my blood and my immune system, I mean. I don't know what trying to share that with you would actually do. It might not be good for you. If there's some other way, we can try to. Cringe-Windla's trio of exposed tendrils suddenly whirled into motion once more, including the one he had extended to the ground in order to make contact. It was like standing too close to an ambulatory crane. The white-scaled flesh shot upwards, the sheer size and strength buffeting us with a gale of wind. Preem had to hang on to Evelyn. Nicole's coat flapped out with an audible crack. I stumbled and clung to the shell with all my tentacles, swallowing an instinctive hiss. Seven stood unmoved, hair ruffled by the breeze. The 3 tendrils of pale flesh arced high above the dome of purple liquid, then curled inward like fish hooks. The spiraling mass of bubble servitors shot upward to join them, moving as if caught in high winds, then pulling into a tight circle. Heather, what the hell is he doing? Evelyn spat. I don't know. Self-surgery, said Preem. Evie looked at her in slowly dawning realization. Went Sevens. I strongly suggest that none of us move. He knows where we're standing. He will take care. If I am correct. What? Nicole turned wide-eyed terror on Sevens. You don't mean oh you massive CU. Nicole's colorful insult was drowned out by the noise of 3 giant snakes plunging through the world's largest and messiest soap bubble, a vast, ground-shaking splur that sounded more scatological than I had expected. The sound probably would have made Lozzie giggle, if the sight wasn't so overwhelming. Above us, Cringe-Windla jammed his 3 tendrils right back through his outer membrane and into the writhing snake core of his own body. The purple membrane split open at the top, where he'd inserted the 3 tendrils, peeling open like a flower made of flesh, but instantly trying to wrap itself closed again. Great ripping and tearing sounds rolled from within Cringe-Windla's depths, like a distant earthquake grinding below our feet. The snake knot inside him suddenly stopped moving, then seized hard as if with a great muscular spasm. I couldn't help but cower at this vast spectacle, hiccuping and cringing and trying not to hiss. Evelyn was the same, huddling in Preem's arms and gritting her teeth, hands clamped over her ears. Sevens was unaffected, but Nicole had curled up, arms over her head. Marmite was clinging to the ground like a spider in a hurricane. We weren't built to experience something on this scale. It was like standing too close to the fury of a volcanic eruption. But deep down inside, I recognized this moment, an abyssal leviathan, exerting all its strength. I yearned to join in. Cringe-Windla's muscular clench ended with a meaty ripping sound worse than the innards of 1,000 slaughterhouses. His bubble membrane seemed to flex and bend, as if something inside him was moving in the wrong way, bulging outward. The 3 vast tentacles went taut with strain. Reel it in, said Preem, her voice clear as a bell amid the chaos and cacophony. Almost there. Inside me, I felt Cringe-Windla nod a thank you for the encouragement. Perhaps we should have had Preem doing the talking all along. With one giant muscular pull, Cringe-Windla's 3 tendrils hauled their catch-up from inside his own body, wrenching it past the membrane and up into the open air. A parasite, a gray slug shrimp thing plated with thin beetle-like carapace, covered with little barbs and hooks and wriggling legs. Except Cringe-Windla's parasite was the size of a cargo ship. Sheets of rank mucus fell from the parasite like rain. Cringe-Windla's tentacles gripped it so hard that flakes of carapace cracked off and fell through the air, large enough to flatten us all. We were only saved by the sheer sizes and distances involved, and perhaps by Cringe-Windla's care toward the weird little apes who had ventured inside his own body. No thank you, detective, said Sevens. You must find a special friend for that. What? Sevens' moment of absurdity helped short-circuit Nicole's instinctive panic, which was lucky because I couldn't help. I was lost deep in the rapture of shared victory, a feedback loop from Cringe-Windla's own sense of violation and rage. He was very, very angry with this thing that had the gall to invade his body. He'd seen off much worse in the distant past, nightmares this little gnat couldn't even dream of. In my mind's eye, the old crippled man with the crutches and the bent back was clutching a gutting knife. Cringe-Windla slammed the parasite against the ground with two tentacles, like a man killing a fish by smashing it against the side of a boat. It was like a bomb going off. The ground shook. Gray meat splattered like an earthslide of blood and guts. Fragments of gray carapace cracked off and spun away in all directions except toward us, carefully blocked by the third tentacle. Far off to our right, the parasite was like a new mountain range of ruined shell and pulped meat. It writhed and shook, pinned by two vast tentacles, making a pitiful effort to drag itself away. But then the bubble servitors descended upon it, like a cloud of bees, or perhaps a shoal of piranhas. They swarmed every exposed scrap of flesh, pressing in close, covering the parasite with semi-transparent bubbles. A horrible hissing, popping, fizzing sound filled the air, louder and louder. Moments later, the parasite stopped struggling, and lay still. A smell like cooked meat filled the air, rancid and rotten. Silence slowly returned, like the world filtering back after an avalanche. The crackle and pop of carbonising meat went on like a distant bonfire, joined briefly by a long, slow slurping sound, the sound of Cringe-Windla's membrane repairing itself, sealing his snake-knot core inside once again. Our own panting, shocked breathing finally filled my ears. Nicole looked like she wanted to curl up in a ball and stop thinking. I was thrumming with sympathetic rightness and shared disgust, nodding at Cringe-Windla even though he probably had no idea what the gesture meant. Preem raised a fist. "Kaiju fight oh," she said. Nicole burst out laughing, a bit too hard, grimacing through her teeth. Evelyn sighed and groaned into her hand. I croaked more like a lizard than a human being, then cleared my throat and tried again. Well done, Cringe-Windla. Thank you. I don't know what I was expecting. What need does a god have of mortal help? Sevens asked. She shot me a sideways look and I read it instantly. Except me, she seemed to say. Exactly, Evelyn managed to squeeze out, wrinkling her nose at the terrible meaty stench. Cringe-Windla is much larger than us, for a start. Though, Heather, he hasn't hurt himself doing that, has he? I blinked several times as the idea descended through my subconscious. An image returned like a bubble of swamp gas floating up from the murky depths, the crippled old man, cleaning his knife, licking fresh blood from his yellowed teeth. He winked at me. I think he's just fine, I said. We all took a moment to gather our wits and share exhausted looks. Marmite slowly crept out from beside the ancient church and got close enough to wrap a bony tentacle around my leg. Good boy, I murmured, absently patting him with a tentacle of my own. So is that it? Nicole asked, putting her hands on her hips and staring out at the massive dead parasite, like a beached whale. Beneath the semi-transparent layer of bubble servitors, the gray carapace and burst flesh were slowly turning black. That lifts the whole nightmare, that's it. She snorted and shook her head. Listen to me, wow, is that it, like we didn't just watch a kaiju fight. She shot me a look. And you were so certain this wouldn't be a Godzilla situation. Kaiju fight, said Preem. She almost seemed excited, though no less impassive than always. I have been known to be wrong, I said, still a little dazed. Why is everything so bloody big? Nicole asked. She gazed up at the huge soap bubble with its 3 tendrils, still towering over us and pumping out that purple light. Your great big caterpillar thing, in Camelot, that was big too. Why is everything so massive? Gods are big, said Preem. Not always, said Sevens. Then she added, almost like an afterthought, the nightmare is lifted. What about all the others? I asked. Oh, Rain. I fumbled my mobile phone from my pocket, hands still shaking with adrenaline. Inside my head, Cringe-Windla leaned over my shoulder to have a look. But there was no signal, not down here in the bowels of the earth and half outside of reality. Oh no. If she's been freed, she'll be looking for me. I suspect we'll be hearing from them soon enough, said Sevens. Wait, Nicole said. What about all the other parasites? Or is this like a Dracula's castle thing? She thumbed at the giant dead parasite. Dracula's castle? I asked, blinking in confusion. And, no, Hringewindla is dealing with the ones inside his family. His cult, I mean. Right now. I think. It's hard to process what any of this means, I'm sorry. What about the one inside me? Nicole tapped her chest. It's dead, said Sevens. Parasitic proximity. She gestured at the mountain of blackening meat with her umbrella. The larger one took precedence. No doubt it would have tried to re-jump the species gap, back to us, if we had continued to communicate. So I've got a dead thing wedged in my chest. Nicole swallowed, going pale, one hand pressed to her breastbone. No. It has reverted to information. Sevens nodded once to her, a slightly amused look in the arch of her eyebrows, or was that just my imagination? If it had died while you were outside, that would have been different. Then where are we now? Nicole gestured around us. Inside Hringewindla, I answered on reflex. Nicole gestured angrily at the dead parasite again. Then why was that one not information? Evelyn sighed. I keep telling you, detective. Don't think about it. Nicole threw up her hands, but she laughed with undeniable relief. Inside my mind, down in a subconscious place I'd never known about before, Hringewindla and I were having a kind of conversation. It wasn't conducted via words or speech, but images and ideas. I didn't have to vocalize, and he didn't have to explain himself. The withered old man with the leg braces and the gutting knife was busy dicing up the gray-fleshed parasites that had invaded the minds of his friends. I asked him if he wanted help. Real help. He was terribly disabled, after all, and even if I couldn't stretch brain math that far, I felt compelled to offer. He was alien and gigantic, had almost killed us by mistake, and infested human minds with an irresistible need for information, but he was hardly comparable with the worst that outside had to offer. He turned me down with a twinkle in his eye and a creased smile on his papery face. Even if I patched the hole in his shell, there was so little of him left now. So much flesh to recreate, so much of him lost. And would it really be him? He wanted safety and security now, not more risk. He was so very old and very tired, but very comfortable here. Was there any other way I could help? Yes, oh yes, little ape. Little squid, I am sorry, I apologize. These old eyes are not what they once were. Little squid, you can help, by not cutting off Hringewindla from his friends. His interface with the world. His eyes and ears and life beyond this shell. Don't be so cruel to them. Please. In an imaginary space that was not a space at all, I patted the hand of an old and slightly confused man. He went on slicing up dead meat, angry with the person who dared to meddle with his people. Mages. Dealt with plenty of them before, haven't we? Edward Lilburn. No idea where you might find him. Good luck though. Back out in reality, Evelyn was frowning at me. Her face was lit by that oily purple light. Heather. I'm here. Just communicating. I blinked at her, pulling myself back from the crackling fireside. Time to go, I think, she said. She wasn't talking to me. The oily slug ooze in my brain did not move. I swallowed, suddenly worried. The old man went on chopping and chopping and chopping. I don't think he knows how to leave, I said. I'm going to have to use brain math, like I said, to remove the connection. Why would you want to leave, little squid? Don't you want to be my friend too? The old man turned towards me, inside my imagination, with the gutting knife in his hand. Alone in a cabin deep in the woods, far from the paved roads and familiar signposts of civilization, in the dead of night beside a crackling fireplace, a pair of comfortable armchairs, and a butcher's toolbox of knives displayed on a bare wooden wall. Some of the knives are chipped and scratched from years of use, from biting into bone or sawing through cartilage. Others are worn down to nubs of their former glory from decades of resharpening. But every blade is free of rust, clean and cared for, trophies of the hand that made the stroke and sliced the meat and severed the tendons. Alone with a disabled old man, bent-backed and shrunken, skin dry and papery and yellowed like parchment, his hair and beard a scraggly mess, his legs braced by steel and plastic to support his crumbling bones, with crutches under his armpits to help him hobble about his reduced and narrow world, the inside of this single cabin. Alone with an old man, clutching a well-used knife in his hand, asking why I didn't want to be his friend. It was like a scene from one of the horror movies that I refused to watch with Rain, not the silly, comfortable, over-the-top Hammer horror style at all. Except I wasn't actually there. I wasn't experiencing any of that with my real senses. These images were merely my human imagination doing the best it could to frame and process the wordless conversation I was holding with Hringewindla. This was how my mind interpreted direct contact between me and an outsider god. My physical body, the real me whatever that meant anymore, was still standing inside. The heart of his vast and ravaged shell, next to the shriveled remains of his fleshy core, the gigantic snake knot inside the purple membrane, and the 3 tentacles he had extended beyond that final barrier. The kindly old man gripping the knife was actually a blob of outsider flesh the size of a football stadium. He was inside my head in a very literal sense. Hringewindla's contact medium, a slug of black ooze, had slipped along the inside of one tentacle and crawled up my spine until I'd let it past my own final barrier. Now it lay across the physical fabric of my brain, soaked into my gray matter like a film of oily slime, sluicing between my neurons. It should have felt disgusting enough to make me retch and scream. On the edge of my awareness, abyssal instinct twitched and flexed with a desire to scratch at my scalp, bore a hole in my own skull, and remove this infestation. But Hringewindla had quieted that disgust, wrapped me in warm comfort and reassurance, and made having a brain slug seem almost normal. Alone with an outsider, in my head. Except I wasn't alone, not really. I was never alone anymore, not unless I chose to be. Evelyn must have seen the flare of panic behind my eyes, the sudden alarm when Hringewindla turned to me with that metaphorical knife in one hand. He wasn't the only one holding a weapon. Evie brought her bone wand up in both hands again, contorting her fingers across the surface of scrimshawed magical symbols. She stumbled, mishandling her own walking stick, but Preem was there to catch her and hold her tight. "Heather?" Evelyn hissed between gritted teeth, eyes blazing. "He doesn't know how to leave. Then I will make it very clear to him. You hear me in there? Do you?" I knew very well she wasn't talking to me. "Ah," said Sevens, with a wet click of her lips. Marmite tightened his grip around my left thigh, like a hound trying to stay close to his master. "Hey, what?" Nicole said, suddenly alarmed again. She turned away from the sight of Hringewindla's removed and dead parasite, lying far off to one side like a slowly blackening mountain range of gray flesh and cracked carapace. It lay beneath deep drifts of bubble servitors still cooking the thing to make sure it was inert. The sound of sizzling meat still filled the air. "What's the panic? What's going on now?" "Our new friend has overstayed his welcome," said Sevens. "Which is a pity, because he deserves the company." "Heather?" Evelyn hissed my name again. I swear she moved like she was going to bonk me on the head with her bone wand. "Wait, please, wait." I snapped at everybody, putting my hands and several of my tentacles up to get them to stop talking at me for a second. I can't concentrate on 2 things at once. "Let me talk with him, please." Evelyn looked at me like I didn't know my own mind, like I was suggesting I should go walking alone in an abandoned and semi-flooded mineshaft. She looked ready to knock me out and solve this herself, probably with far more violence. "Evie, I'm going to be fine," I blurted out. "If the worst comes to the worst, I can always." "Everybody grab a tentacle," Evelyn spoke over me, then glanced at Nicole. "Mostly you, detective." What?" I blinked in confusion. "In case of emergency," Evelyn said through clenched teeth. She nodded sideways at the trio of giant white tentacles far up in the air above our heads, still dripping with vile fluids from Hringewindla's dead parasite. It took me a moment to catch on. What Evelyn meant is that I might have to slip us out, and quickly. The old man inside my mind tilted his head to one side. He didn't understand that at all. He didn't understand how I could leave. Oh. I said out loud, for the others. Go ahead, yes, feel free, tentacles for everyone, I suppose." We then commenced what had to be one of the most awkward group hugs in all history, still plagued by that toxic purple light making every exposed inch of skin itch. I wrapped a single tentacle around Evelyn and Preem combined. Evie helped by pinning it under one armpit, like I was securing her into the seat of a roller coaster. Nicole grimaced and politely allowed me to coil a tentacle around her arm, a firm handshake to anchor her if I had to leave in a hurry. Sevens shrugged minutely and said something about being fine on her own, but she graciously accepted the tip of one tentacle in her free hand, like a dancing partner. Marmite already had a very firm grip around my thigh. "Well?" Evelyn said. "Speak to him, then. I think he's just confused, just doesn't understand. He's never left somebody's head before, he doesn't have the concept. What need for confusion? We're friends now, we're getting to know each other, and I can tell you've got so many interesting and fascinating stories to share. You've been to all sorts of places and met all sorts of strange people, people I could never even imagine. The others, my other friends, they're all very interesting and sweet, and Amanda is very affectionate, but I would also like to hear your stories. Stay by the fire. Why do you need to go back out into the dark?" The old man still held the knife, staring at me with eyes sunken in great masses of wrinkled flesh and liver-spotted skin. He smiled and showed the stubs of his teeth. "Those aren't my thoughts," I sighed out loud, staring up at the vast bulk of the real, physical Hringewindla, to keep myself grounded. "But they could be my thoughts, couldn't they? They could be our thoughts. Like Amanda's thoughts are my thoughts and your thoughts and—" "Stop, please," I said out loud. "I'm not one of yours. Alone with an outsider in my head." Even Evelyn didn't really understand what that meant. I'd been here before. Inside the image that was both metaphor and reality, the dialogue of electrical impulse and pneumosomatic mind link, the cabin in the woods that was not real but also more real than my physical body, I unfurled my self-image. Unlike physical reality, there were no boundaries, no limits, no pesky bone structure or blood vessels or nerve endings to worry about, no risk of massive hemorrhage or organ damage or strangling myself on my own umbilical cord. In here, I was unbounded. I uncoiled 6, then 12, then 24 tentacles, creating for myself a halo of barbed and venomous threat display. I blinked 3 sets of eyelids, layering species of vision that no human eyeball could receive, no human brain process. I plated my soft and vulnerable skin with biosteel and chitinous carapace, flushed the gaps with toxins, and colored myself with warning pigments in pink and red and yellow. I rammed my muscles full of excess fibers and anchored them beneath a growing exoskeleton. I sharpened my teeth to razor points and hollowed my tongue for a darting stinger and felt a tail sprout from the base of my spine as the vertebrae extended into spikes. Spines sprouted from my skin, the gaps between my fingers filled in with webbing, and my voice became an abyssal hiss from the darkest pit of my own childhood terrors. Hringewindla's little gutting knife shook like a leaf. I reached out with one tentacle and took it from him. "I already told you," I said in a voice not remotely human, "you're inside my head on sufferance." The little old man ducked and cringed, fumbling his crutches as his knees quivered. He wiped gray parasite blood on his jumper with shaking hands. He hobbled away from me and all but collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his arms. In reality, I breathed out a shuddering breath. I wasn't sure if any of that was going to work until I'd taken the risk. After all, the real Hringewindla was very large, no matter how much scary squid I could channel. He could have called my bluff. But he really was a terrified old man. Evelyn was looking at me with terrible alarm, eyes wide, lips tight. Nicole seemed a little worried too. "Ah," I croaked. "I know you make strange noises sometimes," Evelyn said, "but that was a little disconcerting, even for you." "Ah." I blinked several times and cleared my throat, which felt like untying a knot. "Oh, did I say that part out loud?" Nicole forced a very awkward laugh. "Less say and more gargle with acid. Sevens nodded with gentle agreement, though I got the sense she somehow approved. "Pretty voice," said Preem. I cleared my throat again, blushing and fussing with my hands at my neck, like I wanted to reach in and straighten out my vocal cords. "Well?" Evelyn snapped. I'm pretty sure he's absolutely terrified of me," I said. "He genuinely doesn't understand how to leave my head. I think I can do it myself though, but as soon as I do, we'll lose the connection. No more communication. And he's so old." Nicole pointed at Hringewindla, the real Hringewindla, the giant tentacle monster cone snail from outside. That is scared of you?" "Sort of. Yes." She sighed and pulled a very odd smile. "Remind me to bring you along on my next dodgy job, I guess." "Absolutely not," Evelyn said. Hey. Nicole put her hands up. The gesture pulled one of my tentacles with her. "It was a joke, yeah. A joke. I'm not gonna take a uni student on a stakeout. Even one of you lot." "Right. Yes. Of course." Evelyn cleared her throat and looked back to me. "Well, Heather? Get on with it so we can leave." I'd made it sound too simple. Back in the deep dark forest of the mind, I was staring down at that withered old man, huddled in an armchair that dwarfed his twisted body. I couldn't hate him, or even be afraid of him, not really. He was barely even still here, just a scrap of memories and leathery old flesh, hanging on in this hole in the ground for a few more centuries. He was desperate for experience, for a life beyond this. He'd found it in the companionship of creatures so much smaller than himself. Who were we to tell him that was wrong? Nobody was being coerced here. Were they? I didn't think they were. In a distant and difficult way, he reminded me of Maisie. So I told him about her. Not with words, of course, but in a slew of emotions and images, human principles and human thoughts. I told this outsider god about my twin sister. I told him all about how we'd grown up together, so very similar and alike, physically identical twins wearing each other's faces. He looked up as I began to explain, the fear on his face replaced with a hungry look, ravenous for information and experience. But when I told him what had happened to us, his curiosity turned gray. His lower lip quivered. His hands clutched at the arms of his chair. I told him a little about Wonderland. He ducked his head and shivered, whimpering. I told him about the eye and he mewled, "Please no." I told him about the bad years of madness and pain, but then I also told him about Rain, and Evelyn, and the others, and how far I'd come, and what I was planning to do. He listened, nodding slowly, staring up at me with those glassy eyes filmed with cataracts. "And that's why you don't want to come with me. You don't want to go to Wonderland, even inside my head. You know what I am." I wasn't quite sure if that was my thought, or his, but his liver-spotted head bobbed up and down in his chair. He was really trying, and not just because he was terrified of my razor-tipped tentacles and my maw full of sharp teeth. He was trying to absorb, to comprehend, to relate. But as he nodded his head and blinked those shrunken and rheumy eyes and smiled a papery little smile, I got the impression he didn't really understand at all. Windla did not understand what a twin was, or why I cared. I had a vague sense that to him we were as difficult to tell apart as a pair of ants. Can a human tell if two gnats are identical twins? But he listened anyway, fascinated and deeply interested, trying to imagine what life was like for me. Even if he failed, the attempt was real. When I finished, Windla the old man opened his dry and thin-lipped mouth with a sound like dusty parchment, behind the tangle of thick grey beard. And he told me a story too. A story of jumbled sense impressions and powerful, raw, unfiltered emotion. Outsiders, true outsiders, beings dredged from the deeps of the abyss to impose their selfhood upon the myriad worlds beyond Earth, do not experience memory or sensory processing in the same way as a human being. They don't even experience those things in a consistent way to each other. But I had stretched my own sense of self so far beyond human baseline. Windla's stuttering, halting, rambling tale built his own perspective for me, from elements he did not understand. Any other human mind may have frayed under the strain, found it impossible to separate the sensory inputs into ones that we could actually process. But I did. So he told me a story. Half a mile up, through senses that had no human analog, Windla looked down on a gathering of his friends. The inside of his shell was identical to how we had found it, but the human was different. There was no portalo back then, no little petrol-driven generator, no modern camping supplies. The tents were a much older design as well, archaic two-peg-style shelters from the blasting light of his presence. One small scrap of thinking flesh stood forward from the gathering, past the line of red paint. They'd used red paint back then, too. Amanda Hopton, 9 years old, dressed in a scarlet robe, hands bound and eyes blindfolded, the kind of bloody altar-and ritual chanting business that Evelyn had been so certain the cult must still practice. And they had, only a few decades earlier. Windla did not understand terms like human sacrifice. Amanda Hopton, a tiny shivering figure, no older than I had been when the eye had taken me and Maisie away from reality. Windla had already soaked deep into the whirls and wrinkles of her brain. He knew her, he'd known her since she was 6 months old, he'd cradled her and rocked her to sleep and not understood any of it, except this weird mewling puppy needed to be held and encouraged to exist. But now her head was full of enforced devotion, the religious fervor of other friends that he didn't understand either, a feedback loop of the darkest corner of human culture dumping toxic waste back into this outsider god. Our toxicity. Our madness. Not his. Windla's memories didn't identify the other members of the cult there that day, not as individuals. But I could. I spotted Christine Hopton, another little girl only a few years older than her doomed sister, hiding her eyes in a woman's skirts, a woman holding a third baby in her arms and trying not to weep. Two figures led a rising chant by the stone altar in the ancient church, a man and a woman, both of them old and sinewy, stripped half-naked, painted with symbols in black tar on their flesh. Others joined them in praise for their god, urging him to accept their offering of new flesh for his ravaged form. The family resemblance was unmistakable, but I didn't need to rely on human facial recognition. I could dip into Windla's memories with senses I did not possess. I could read their pheromones, their bodily history, their DNA. The man and the woman, screaming and chanting, were Twill's great-grandparents. But then everything had changed, very quickly. Several of Windla's friends had gone away. The noise had spiked, then stopped. The urging to eat had faded. The images he fed me made no sense to him. He held them out to me like photographs of a strange dance from a foreign culture he'd only ever seen in badly explained television documentaries. A man with a very old rifle in his hands, who looked like he knew how to use it. A striking family resemblance to Twill, in the face and the compact frame, but mostly the sheer physical confidence. An argument, the man with the gun on one side, the half-naked great-grandparents on the other, going red in the face with rage at his interruption. Everyone gesticulating at the tiny, shivering child, Amanda Hopton, past the red line and waiting for the final communion with their god. I watched Hringe memories as he showed me Twill's grandfather shoot his own parents. There were 6 corpses that day. The old heads of the cult. Patricide, matricide. Nobody else had guns. The cult cowed. There would be no more human sacrifices. The man with the rifle stepped over the red line too and scooped up little Amanda in one arm. A new prayer blossomed in Hringe mind. Hringe lowered the photographs and stared at them again, lost in memories he didn't understand. He didn't know why several friends had gone away, or what murder was, or why a parent might slaughter the most repulsive elements of their own community to save their child's life. All he knew is that Amanda touched his outstretched tentacle with a little hand and he wouldn't be fed any more thinking flesh. He knew this was important. That's why he told me. But he had no idea why. Heather? Evelyn hissed. Out in reality, only a moment or 2 had passed. Ah. Heather, you're crying. What is happening in there? Crying, yes, I know, I said, sniffing back tears and scrubbing my eyes on the back of my already bloody sleeve, smearing the earlier blood tears around even worse than before. I was already a mess, more didn't matter right now. I'm learning just how much Hringe doesn't understand, that's all. It's well, he's telling me a story. Stories can be lies, Evelyn said gently. Not from one so old, I think, said Sevens. She was gazing up at the real Hringe her face lit by that purple light, shifting like oil on water. Evelyn kept scratching her own scalp and hands, but Sevens seemed largely immune to the irritating quality of the light. He doesn't understand anything, I said. About us, I mean. He's Hringe confusion was not over. Inside my imagination, the extended and slightly tortured metaphor of the old disabled man did the equivalent of reaching beneath his chair and pulling out a photo album. He opened the cover and held the album up to me with shaking hands, asking a question that my mind could not even process into human terms, a question so wordless and ultimate that I felt a pang of sympathy deep in my chest. Twill, it was all Twill. Being born, growing up, seen from the eyes of every single person in her family, a scrap of thinking flesh that he didn't know, that he couldn't know. He knew her because he knew all her family. He knew all these people who loved her, everyone in her life. She was wrapped at the core of so much care. But he didn't know her. Why? I managed to form the question, as best I could. He'd tried to, once, a long time ago. But the man with the gun Twill's grandfather, I realized, old and gray in this memory, leathery and sinewy with age and determination had done something to her, made her poisonous to him. He recoiled from a memory of snapping canine jaws and sharp, raking claws, hiding within her like a secret second self ready to tear his connection to shreds. But who is she? He asked me the question and my answer was not enough. That's Twill, I said out loud. It's just Twill. Heather, what? Evelyn said. Sorry, he doesn't know who Twill is. Evelyn gave me a scrunched frown. What? Don't talk nonsense, she's Oh. Evelyn cleared her throat. Then I was right. About her grandfather's motivations, yes. I sniffed hard, but tears were running down my cheeks. Twill did not become a werewolf as a teenager. The seeds were planted when she was barely an infant, against her parents' consent, to keep the god out of her head. She wasn't a foot soldier at all. She was an experiment in freedom. I did the one thing I'd been resisting this whole time, assured at last that it was not a trap. I walked over to the crackling fireplace and sat down in the other armchair, opposite the metaphor of Hringe That wasn't even his real name, just a description of him in Old English, the best that some intrepid fool had managed to choke out upon first discovering him down here. His real name wasn't a word, obviously. Trying to speak it with a human mouth would have caused terrible pain, and probably hurt the ears to hear it said aloud. But it meant something like Spiraled Explorer. He'd chosen it himself, a long time ago. He showed me other relics that lay about his isolated cabin in the woods, not just the knives. He had a piece of shell wrapped in a handkerchief, not a piece of his shell, but that of his best friend, or mate, or double, I couldn't quite understand. He had a coin, a little 5-pointed star made of greenish soapstone, taken from somewhere that had used currency, somewhere he'd once visited where the locals had liked him very much. He had a dead rat preserved in a jar, an old pet from somewhere else, never buried because she had asked not to be left for the worms. He had a collection of dice carved from the bones of a mentor, a cracked and chipped cup that had held the blood of a saint, and a wooden puzzle box that he still didn't know how to open, gifted to him by a sinister figure in his youth. Were these physical objects, held somewhere within his snake-knot core? Or were they just metaphors for memories? I asked the question, but it made no sense to him. I decided not to think too hard. Eventually, I made the mistake of asking how he had gotten here, to Earth. The story was a blast of incomprehensible memory, of a fight on a scale I could not comprehend, not without totally abandoning my personhood and plunging into the abyss. I listened politely, nodding along to an old man's war story that meant nothing to me, full of sound and fury but no sense. Out in reality, a hand squeezed mine, and pulled me back. "Heather," Evelyn said, peering into my face, far too close for comfort. "Heather, that is all well and good, but he needs to leave your mind, now. Are you listening to me in there, Cringewindla? You need to leave Heather's mind." I pulled back from Evelyn, suddenly self-conscious at our faces being only inches apart. But Cringewindla didn't understand. It was like asking one of us to cease all communication, not just to stop talking, but to stop body language, all sound, even the reflection of light on our skin and clothes. "He's not going to resist or try to hurt me," I said. "But I am going to have to remove him by force. If at all." "If at all." Evelyn echoed back at me. "He's just lonely. He's not a dog that's followed you home," she snapped right in my face. "Heather, he's messing with the inside of your head. He's not meant to be in there. Sevens, for pity's sake, help me here." But 7 shades of sunlight merely blinked slowly and sighed a sigh full of melancholy. I cannot deny others the balm of her attention. "You should understand that better than myself, Evie." Evelyn slammed to a stop, mouth working but no sound coming out. It was the first time Sevens had called her Evie. "You best be bloody sure he's not going to resist," Nicole said, leaping in before I could start blushing at the deeper meaning of Sevens' words. Nicole pointed up at the 3 giant tentacles standing tall as skyscrapers above us. "He's not what we thought," I managed to say. "He's not." But that didn't mean he wouldn't crush us in confused pain. Could I remove the oily sludge from between the neurons of my own brain? Absolutely. All I had to do was allow my own abyssal immune system inside my gray matter. Modifying the selective permeability of my own blood-brain barrier was not beyond the limits of abyssal biological modification. I had purged Uranjua's influence with relative ease, and that had been a fast-growing rot in flesh and soul. Cringewindla's contact surface was nothing by comparison, a gentle hand on my shoulder. I could melt and remetabolize it in seconds, I had no doubt. But he was old and sweet and very confused, very tired, very curious. It would burn him, scorch his flesh, make him retract his hand. I wasn't even sure I wanted to do it, but I had to. My mind was my own, no matter how much I had enjoyed this little chat. I tried to tell him I had to go, tried to explain this might hurt. I asked him please not to lash out. He stared at me with gummy, sunken eyes, and did not comprehend. He wanted to show me more of his special treasures, hobbling around his cabin, animated and happy now. "You know, you should really visit my father," said Sevens. I turned to her, my eyes brimming with tears. She nodded to herself. Inside my mind, the old man paused, as if hearing a voice from nowhere. "My father does not get many chances to spend time with those of his own caliber," Sevens went on. And a good show can always invigorate a degraded mind. What do you say, Cringewindla? Would you like to visit the palace? Inside my imagination, an image floated forth, a gracious refusal, an embarrassed old man being modest about his social circles, that being, none at all. Sevens, I hissed, I need to concentrate, I need to make him understand this might hurt, it might be a kind of severing, Heather, Evelyn snapped. Just take us all outside. But then we'd be abandoning him. I blurted out. And I need to make him see, before I do it. A visit to the stage, Sevens purred. To the backstage, to back rooms of. Whoa, hey, Nicole said. Outside again. Evelyn snapped. You owe this thing nothing, Heather. Get us out of here. I almost sobbed. If I can't communicate properly with him, then what hope do I have for communicating with the eye? I can't just leave and. With a gentle puff-pop of displaced air and a tap-tap of pink Converse shoes on the surface of Cringewindla's shell, a floaty jellyfish flutter of blue, pink, and white appeared in front of us. Lozzie! I cried. Heathy, she cheered, throwing her hands in the air. There you are. Found you. Lozzie was a splash of vibrant color against the bone-white dead surfaces of Cringewindla's shell, wrapped in her pastel poncho, her hair all fluffed up, blonde strands all over the place like she'd been dancing outdoors in a storm. She had the goofiest grin on her face, eyes so bloodshot she looked ready to sleep, hands bunched in her poncho to flap it about. Cringewindla's toxic purple light did not seem to touch her, as if she was lit by some other, invisible source, her hues and shades inviolate from exterior interference. She was also wearing nothing on her lower half except her shoes. Luckily her poncho was long enough to cover her hips. Bare legs poked out below the hem, unself-consciously nude. Oh shit, Evelyn snapped, eyes whipping over to Nicole and then the giant, dead parasite that Cringewindla had ripped out of himself. Calm yourself, magician, said Sevens. The little one is untouched. The parasites are all dead. Lozzie didn't give a hoot about parasites, dead or otherwise. She was too busy throwing herself at me in the most wriggly, fidgety hug I'd ever experienced. She somehow got in between everyone else, avoided all my tentacles, and wrapped her arms around me, but then wouldn't stop moving and making purring noises and jiggling one leg. It was like being hugged by a cat which wasn't sure if it wanted to be picked up or not. Lozzie. I hugged her back, laughing but concerned. What, how did you? Rain called me. Lozzie chirped, then hopped back a step like a bird considering a curious worm, tilting her head to one side, giggling all the while. She didn't know where you'd gotten to. Then she called me and Jan, but Jan didn't want to come, so I went beep and went on my own to Rain, because I know Rain so well it's easy to find her. And it's chaos. Everyone is there. Twill's family too. So then I came to find you. And oh, hello. Lozzie ducked her head and waved to Marmite. The huge squid spider pressed himself lower to the ground and more firmly behind me, as if suddenly shy. This is Marmite, yes, Lozzie. Hi Marmite. Lozzie waved with both hands. Marmite bobbed one bony tentacle back at her. Lozzie, Preem intoned. That got her attention, head up, eyes sleepy and bloodshot, but listening clearly. Preem gestured at me and Lozzie's eyes followed the gesture to the end of Preem's fingers, again like a cat. Lozzie, I said, trying not to explode with worry, are the others okay? Rain and Zhang and Twill. And Twill's family? There were kids there, too, little children trapped in a nightmare. Lozzie closed both eyes and nodded like she was a bobblehead figurine, far more than necessary. Nobody was bleeding and nobody was crying. Bubbles everywhere though. Zooming about. The bubble servitors, Evelyn said, jaw clenched tight. Lozzie, you're certain there wasn't anything untoward happening? She didn't even wait for an answer before turning to me. We have to get back right now, before something else goes wrong. Why yes, I said, trying to feel confidence that I didn't believe. It's fine, Lozzie said, eyes still closed, as if she could see without sight. Lozzie, Evelyn said sharply. We are in the middle of a crisis. Are you still high? Nicole sighed, sounding sort of wistful. Looks like it to me. Yes. Lozzie shot one hand into the air like an overeager student ready to answer an easy question. I started laughing, all the tension of the last few hours peeling off me under the force of the Lozzie pressure washer. Wish I wasn't sober right now, Nicole added. Don't suppose I could get some of that good stuff later, hey? Turning to Evelyn had finally forced Lozzie's eyes out across the rest of the plain of boneshell and twisted pillars, out toward the vast mountainside of dead parasite, still sizzling gently as the bubble servitors cooked every inch of gray meat to make sure it was dead. Lozzie's mouth opened, slack with sleepy-eyed fascination as she took in the surroundings, as she stared at the distant hole in Hringewindla's shell, and the vast scorch and claw marks that had ruined his once great flesh, so long ago. Oh, she went, as if we were standing in a theme park. How are you not freaked out by this? Nicole asked. Is it the weed? Be gay, do crimes, Lozzie whispered as she looked up at Hringewindla himself, the vast purple dome and the snake knot inside. Oh yeah, sure, Nicole scoffed. That explains everything. Be gay, said Preem. Be polite. Usually better than my solutions, sure, Evelyn muttered. Hey hey. Lozzie suddenly flapped her poncho high in both hands, shouting up at the real, physical Hringewindla. Luckily we all discovered she was not nude beneath the poncho, but was wearing a pair of pink shorts I'd never seen before. I had the sudden and unshakable knowledge that those shorts belonged to January. Hey you. What, you're big. Yeah. Inside my mind, Hringewindla the old man stood up out of his chair suddenly. He smiled like he was seeing an old friend he hadn't clapped eyes on in decades. Lozzie? I said, clearing my throat. Do you and Hringewindla know each other? Lozzie turned back over her shoulder to look at me, chin popping up over the corner of her poncho, sleepy-lidded eyes blinking like an owl in the light. No. I've never seen him before, not until right now. Second-hand pride welled up inside me. The old hunter, his knives worn down, his bones like dead wood, his flesh failing, drew a breath deeper than he had in centuries. Something about this meeting was revitalizing him. Wait a second, please, I said, struggling to keep up. Lozzie, are you communicating with him? Lozzie answered with a song. She turned back to Hringewindla, opened her mouth, and tilted her head back so she was facing directly upward. Her eyes fluttered shut as she let out 3 long, high-pitched, ethereal notes of warbling beauty. For one strange moment she was frozen on the spot, neck stretched upward like a swan, body held poised like a statue as the notes trailed off. Her angelic voice made me blink back tears. Nicole gasped in surprise. Evelyn cleared her throat. Then Lozzie adjusted her posture like a dancer switching to a different freeze frame, or a puppet yanked into a different configuration. She swayed to one side, stopped, and sang again, a ghostly and almost inhuman sound, but still girlish and sweet. Inside my mind, Hringewindla was nodding and crying. The little one has that effect, Sevens murmured. There is a reason she is so beloved by the Kami. Lozzie's singing went on for several minutes, stop-start as she paused to sway and lurch, as if she was searching for the right acoustic angle. The old man inside my head stood up straight and put more strength into his arms to pull himself up on his crutches. The clouds in his eyes seemed to clear away. Eventually, Lozzie trailed off and sighed a little sigh. She gazed out at the distant hole in the shell for a moment, her giddy high transmuted into slow and soft melancholy. It's okay, she murmured to nobody in particular. It's not that big. Lozzie, Evelyn said, clearing her throat and wiping a stray tear from her eyes. We do need to leave. Sooner rather than later. And Heather has to get Hringwindla out of her head. Can you make sense to him for us? Communicate this? I'm really afraid of hurting him, I said. Were you speaking with him just now? Is there anything we can do to make him understand? Lozzie bobbed her head from side to side, flapping her poncho like a stingray's wings, building up steam again after her bout of melancholy. Then she pivoted on one foot, spun toward me, and reached out to press my nose with her thumb. Boop! I laughed, tooted, and rolled my eyes. Lozzie, that's very cute, but it's hardly the time for 7 shades of sunlight took my arm quickly. I suddenly gripped everything I could with my tentacles, Evie, Lozzie, Preem, the ground, my own legs. My eyes bulged and my stomach clenched up like a fist. I gasped and heaved, flailing in panic. The oily slug inside my brain was on the move. Hringwindla's contact medium gathered itself, leaching its own slick and slimy matter from between my neurons, sliding across the inside of my skull. I have felt a great many disgusting sensations in my life, from the sensory violence of outside, to mage nonsense here in reality, from things I don't understand growing inside my own body, to biting infected flesh away from the wounds of a lover. But the brain slug won an award, a round of applause, and almost overpowered my no-vomiting techniques. How many people can say they've felt an alien god physically crawling across their brain? Inside my imagination, the withered old man waved me a friendly goodbye. He turned toward somebody more his own size, somebody wrapped in a pentacolor pastel poncho. But as the contact medium peeled away from my gray matter, the metaphor in my imagination collapsed like reality itself unraveling. I was not talking to an old man at all, I was communicating with something so vast and so alien that the human mind could barely process the information. The warm blanket was pulled off my shoulders, the crackling fire went out, the walls of the cabin fell away, and I was in a void of churning selfhood that threatened to swamp me and drown me. It was a good thing Sevens was holding me, and that Evelyn was wrapped in one of my tentacles. If I'd been alone, I think I would have ripped my own head open to get Hringwindla out. Instead, Sevens held me like a steel vice. Somebody was shouting my name, Evelyn, probably before being soothed by Lozzie's giggling reassurances. I heaved and flailed and wanted to vomit up my entire digestive tract to purge this sensation. A pair of very strong arms found my waist and helped to hold me up as I retched. With a noise like unsticking a melted shoe from hot tarmac, Hringwindla's oil-slick brain-slug contact medium detached from the inside of my skull and found its way through cells and tissue, down into my esophagus. I hacked and coughed and choked, until Preem bent me over and slammed her hand against my back. A glob of purple and white mucus shot from my mouth and splattered on the ground. I hung there, wheezing for breath, watching the little blob of Hringwindla twitch and flex, like a deep-sea mollusk dragged up to the surface to die. Inside my mind, he was gone. The cabin in the woods, the surrounding night, the crackling fire, all of it was gone. Just me again, alone inside my own head. The relief was like a pulled tooth. I'm okay, I wheezed as Preem and Evelyn both tried to handle me in different directions. Yay, went Lozzie. She threw her arms up. Before anybody could make a sensible suggestion, 7 shades of sunlight let go of me, took a half step away, and ceased being human. Hastur's daughter reared up all of a sudden, beetle-black armor plates and yellow frills covering her body, her front a downy mat of soft fur, pincers and needle legs braced against the shell surface ground. It had been bad enough when she'd been standing at a safe distance, but this mask change was up close and personal. Evelyn recoiled so hard she nearly sent us all sprawling with her. Nicole flinched and yelped and covered her mouth. Marmite yanked back and almost took my leg with him. Luckily Preem didn't care, she kept us anchored. Lozzie stared in open-mouthed awe and appreciation. I'd seen that look on her before, but it took me a moment to remember when. It was the exact same way she'd looked at Zheng's boobs. 7 shades of slick and spiky reached down with one bone-like hand, plucked the dying purple slug thing from the ground, and popped it past her facial mandibles. Small chitin plates moved in her throat. Her mouth parts closed. She swallowed. Then, just as suddenly, she was back to the princess mask, unruffled and starched. She shot us all a cool and collected look. "My apologies," she said. "I have sent that to my father." "Oh, well, that's all right then," Evelyn said, dripping with sarcasm. "Perhaps next time you transform into an 8-foot alien monster, you can warn us all first." "Very pretty," said Preem. Lozzie was looking at Sevens like she was a pin-up model, biting her lower lip and twisting on one foot. I didn't blame her. If we'd been anywhere else, I would have been having a very difficult and embarrassing conversation with Sevens right then. But Sevens turned to Lozzie with a strict and unimpressed look. "Little one, you must warn us about this sort of thing in future. Not everyone has multiple breathing holes." Heather was in very mundane and boring danger. "I didn't know it would happen like that." Lozzie protested, gone shrill, hands suddenly fluttering everywhere. I'm sorry." "Heathy, I'm sorry." "It's okay, Loz," I croaked. Preem helped me to straighten up. Evelyn caught my eye, still brimming with misplaced anger. "Evie, she was just doing her best to help. She got Fringewindla out of my head. It worked." "Yes, and, well, good, okay." Evelyn huffed, gritting her teeth and looking like she wanted to belt something with her walking stick, probably Sevens. Lozzie did a nervous, slow flinch away from her, hands curled into the fabric of her poncho. I opened my mouth quickly. "You're not actually angry at..." "I'm not actually angry at," Evelyn said at the exact same time. We looked at each other. Evelyn sighed and averted her eyes. "We love you," Preem said, speaking to Lozzie. Went Lozzie, more than a little confused, heavy-lidded eyes flicking from face to face. Evelyn cleared her throat loudly and turned to Lozzie. "I'm sorry," I snapped. "I'm not actually angry at you, I'm angry at Fringewindla. I'm angry at this entire damn situation, and I'm angry with your uncle, who is subhuman filth for risking even a sliver of this in the first place by creating this kind of monster." She spat the final word and gestured at the vast, dead parasite, the low mountain of blackening flesh and cracked carapace. Lozzie had brightened when Evelyn had begun to apologize. She knew that Evie was sweet on her, really, but her face froze in stoned, bleary-eyed paralysis when Evelyn explained the true and final target of her ire. "Edward did all this," she said, in a tiny voice. Evie froze too. "Oh, bugger," she hissed. "We're not sure," I blurted out. "Probably. Maybe." Lozzie bit her lower lip, but there was nothing coquettish about it now. She suddenly looked much worse for wear, high and confused and far from secure. I reached for her with a tentacle. She accepted it with both hands, hugging it tight to her chest. "You're safe with us, little one," said Sevens. "Oh, yes, of course," Evelyn added awkwardly, trying her best, clearing her throat again. "He's not directly involved, I think that's for certain. You've nothing to fear. We're all together. Aren't we?" I nodded along, smiling at Lozzie. She puffed out her cheeks. "And Tenny is safe back at the house with Jan and July, yes?" I asked. Lozzie nodded at that. "Then we've nothing to worry about." "Nothing to worry about," she says, Nicole added, deep in habitual sarcasm. "I think we've got plenty to worry about right here and now. What are we doing about him?" She gestured up at Fringewindla. Luckily, whatever Lozzie had actually done to eject his brain slug from my cranium, it hadn't hurt Fringewindla, or at least she'd somehow communicated enough to stop him from lashing out in alienated pain. The 3 vast-scaled tentacles hung placid in the air like a trio of seaweed fronds waving in slow current. The snake knot inside his core slithered over itself in an endless dance of leviathan flesh. The bubble membrane poured out toxic light, but had fully sealed itself once more, healing the self-inflicted parasite removal wound. "I don't think we need to do anything." I said. I think. Lozzie turned to look up at Fringewindla, still hugging one of my tentacles like it was a plushie. I'll come see you. Yeah. She glanced back at me. Can I come see him? Do you want to? Lozzie nodded enthusiastically. He's smart. He's got a lot of smarts, and he's feeling a lot better now. I think I can help him walk, maybe. Walk? Nicole echoed. Ah. It's a metaphor, I said. Nope. Lozzie chirped. Like I said, Evelyn grumbled. Don't think about it, detective. You'll be happier that way. Look, I'm trying my best not to think about much here, Nicole replied. But that thing is still a giant squid monster, all right? Can I think about that? If you want, Evelyn grunted. Lozzie was skipping around my side, trying to get close enough to pet Marmite. The squid spider wasn't quite sure about her yet, but he didn't flee. But then Lozzie caught a hint of something in the air. She sniffed loudly. Why does it smell like chickens here? She asked. I'll explain that part later, I sighed. I think it's high time we left. Indeed, Evelyn agreed. What are we doing, a round trip through Camelot, or? Ooh, ooh. Lozzie bounced up on her heels, which made Marmite flinch. I can take us straight back to Twill's farm place. Evelyn wanted to give her a look. I could see it in the tightness of her jaw. But she resisted, and I adored her for that. All right, Evelyn said, sounding covertly unhappy about this. We'll take Lozzie's way, it's quicker and more direct. Nicole, be warned, this does tend to be a little more rough than Heather's technique, so brace. Fringewindla wasn't done yet. With a deep thump of displaced air, one of his 3 vast tentacles descended toward us once again. Everyone froze in shock and horror. For a moment Evelyn scrambled for her bone wand and Sevens went very still, about to switch masks. But then Lozzie cried out, "It's okay," and she turned out to be right. Fringewindla's tentacle slowed as it dipped, buffeting us with wind from above, but far gentler than before. Down and down and down it came, until the skyscraper of white flesh hung level with us once again, facing us with a blunt tip of thick scales. Lozzie let go of my tentacle and skipped forward. For one horrible moment it seemed as if that wall of flesh would swallow her, like she was vanishing into the distance. But then she stopped and bowed, as if with great respect. She held out both hands and touched the end of the tentacle, bowed again, and skipped back over to us, her poncho flapping as she came. For you, she announced, and pressed an object into my hands. It was the coin. A little 5-pointed star, made of greenish soapstone, about the size of a 50-pence piece. Fringewindla had shown me this, inside my imagination, a relic of somewhere he'd once visited. But that was all a metaphor. Wasn't it? I stared at the coin, then up at the snake knot, and ached to ask him a dozen more questions. He says you might need it more than him, one day. Lozzie chirped. Because you might meet the people who gave it to him. People, I murmured. Outsider people. Lozzie shrugged, giggling and flapping her hands, still stoned out of her mind. Sevens, I said. Do you know? But the yellow princess shook her head. To you I may seem well-traveled, but compared to the old man here, I have never ventured beyond the village where I was born. Is he done? Evelyn asked. Lozzie nodded, then turned to wave at the white scales of Fringewindla's tentacle. He did not wave back, which was lucky because the pressure wave would probably have knocked us all over. Good, Evelyn said. Then let's get out of here before he changes his mind. Everyone grab onto Lozzie. I'm popular. Lozzie giggled, turning on the spot and swaying from side to side. Sevens gently took her shoulder to stop her wriggling about. Hey, one more thing, Nicole said. Just before we go. You want to delay this even further? Evelyn asked with a huff. Nah. Just can somebody please go check on my dog after this? We'll make sure your dog is safe, yes, Evelyn grumbled. Doggy, said Lozzie. Good doggo, said Preem. Marmite shuffled behind me, unsure if he was the subject of this unexpected praise. Nicole sighed with a great weariness and joined the Lozzie circle. Evelyn made sure to be holding one of Lozzie's hands. Preem helped me stand up straight as we all braced for the journey. I cast one last glance up at Fringewindla, at his shrunken and shriveled glory, then closed my hand around his soapstone gift. Gearswin Farm. Twill's Farm. Okay, maybe not actually Twill's Farm but Twill's Farm, yay. Fluffy llamas, yes I love them, yes I do. Hi, hi, hi. The moment we arrived back on the surface, Lozzie wriggled out of our collectively collapsing grip and sprang away, bouncing on the balls of her feet, fluttering her pentacollar poncho in the leaf-dappled sunlight, giggling and rambling as she skipped over to the curious and friendly alpaca sticking its head over the nearby fence. Alpaca, not llama, I thought to myself, but there was no way I was getting those words out. The rest of us were mere passengers on the Lozzie train, alighting at this terminal station myself, Evelyn, Preem, Nicole, Sevens, and poor little Marmite. We all but collapsed onto the crumbly, weathered tarmac next to Rain's car. Nicole was the only one who actually lost her footing and went down. She staggered as if seasick, then doubled up, slammed to her knees, and vomited noisily onto the ground. She groaned, clutching her stomach, spitting stringy bile. I would have winced with sympathy, I'd been there so many times before, hurling my guts up as my body rejected the brutal exposure to supernatural truth. But right then I was busy wrapping my arms and tentacles around my swirling, pounding, spinning head. I almost crumpled as well, knees buckling and giving out, racked by the stress of Lozzie's translocation slip. But Sevens stood tall and confident, holding me up with one strong arm around my waist, silently enduring the way I lashed myself to her with my tentacles. The princess mask was apparently unaffected by the pressure of skipping across the membrane between here and outside. I held my squid skull mask to my stomach, a poor substitute for a pillow, but it sufficed. Evelyn hung limp and moaning in Preem's grip, eyes squeezed shut, face gone pale and gray, coated with cold sweat. Her pain was more than physical. Preem stared into blank space, her demon mind still rebooting. Too human to avoid the aftershocks. Marmite curled into a ball and covered himself with shadowy membranes, terrified and sick. Riding along with one of Lozzie's intentional slips was always an ordeal. Whenever I slipped on purpose, the bulk of the damage to mind and body was not actually from the transition itself, but from direct interface with the necessary brain math to etch the equation upon the surface of reality. The damage was from touching the levers, not the outcome of pulling them. Slipping was disorienting and disgusting, yes, of course. Popping through the membrane between here and outside was like having one's soul slid partway out of one's body, then jammed back in at the wrong angle. One was forced to wait for the parts to shift and adjust until container and self lined up again, like the tight and uncomfortable feeling of shrugging your coat on too quickly, but 100 times worse. For a few seconds, a slip always made you feel misaligned with your own body. But Lozzie's slip hadn't taken us outside at all. If I'd been the one to pull us out of Fringewindla's core, I would have taken us to Camelot first, then back to Twill's house, a long-distance slingshot. Lozzie took us straight there, a no-stopping service, express route. It was like being dragged across the membrane at high speed, skipping and bouncing like a flat stone upon the surface of a lake, one's soul jarred and juddered and shaken out of place. No human being could experience that and stand up straight afterward. Even Preem was shaken. I suspected Sevens hadn't actually gone along with it at all, but had used her own, personal, outsider methods of locomotion, and then just pretended she'd piggybacked Lozzie along with the rest of us. But we were out of Fringewindla's shell. We were back on the surface. Firmly back in reality, whatever that meant. Late afternoon sunlight, the color of fire on bronze, filtered through the gently swaying ring of trees that surrounded Gearswin Farm. The tarmac was solid and earthy and crumbling at the edges. The air smelled of pollen and grass and rotting leaves. Shafts of light glinted off Rain's car, the faded red paint dappled by long, leafy shadows. The overgrown fields were matted with weeds and dotted with the tall, proud spikes of thistles, but the landscape was green and healthy and very, very normal. The old farmhouse squatted right where we'd left it, peering back at us with dark windows. The front door showed only a gaping shadow, as if the building itself was surprised by our return. No more living nightmares, no more absurd spooky alpacas with human faces, no more reality warping around our senses. Cringe Winlow was back in control. And so were we. The only physical evidence that anything untoward had happened here was a lump of pulped gray meat and broken carapace, still lying on the tarmac a few feet away, a miniature copy of the Leviathan monster Cringe Windla had pulled from his snake-knot core, complete with little barbs and hooks and grasping legs. The parasite I'd ripped out of Seven's throat had not resurrected itself and wandered off, or melted through the ground to contaminate the local water supply, or turned into a ghost or a vampire or something equally silly. I'd half expected it to do that. Can you really blame me? Of course, I couldn't enjoy the relief. My head was spinning, my senses were filled with a high-pitched whine, and my skin felt thin as rice paper, ready to burst and let me float away into the woods, dispersed and forgotten. Only Seven's grip kept me on my feet. I had an overwhelming urge to jam my squid skull mask back on over my head and curl up in a tight ball of tentacles, like an octopus protecting herself against the dragging currents. And it wasn't only the slip, the whiplash was too sudden. Had I really been a mile underground only minutes earlier, talking to an ancient outsider god via my own neuroelectrical signals? Reality felt unreal. But then hurrying feet and voices and chaos filled the air, the undeniable weight of other people. Heather. Hey. Hey, they're all out here. Twill, get out here. My heart soared at the familiar chord of Rain's voice. I heard the sound of her feet leaping down the brick steps of the house in one bound, racing to join us. Rain, I croaked, groping for her even with my eyes screwed shut. Rain. It's all right, kitten, Sevens purred from right beside me. She is here. Everyone is here. Twill, her mother scolded, not far behind, little shoes hurrying down the steps. Oh, but thank heavens, thank goodness, they're all here. They are all here, aren't they? I am so sorry, Miss Say, Heather, detective, and Good evening, High Priestess, said the Yellow Princess. Do not worry yourself about me. I told you they would show up. Amanda said from the doorway, her voice filled with equal parts pride and relief. He told me they were okay. I told you. You never listen. Amanda, Christine said, voice a bristle of smothered irritation. Do not get into this right now, please. I reached blindly for Rain with one tentacle, found her, and hung on tight. She laughed, wrapped me in a hug, and kissed my forehead. She is safe, but there has been much brain math, Sevens informed her. You got us out of that, hey? Rain asked me. Got you out, I croaked, face cushioned in her chest. Everyone out. Everyone out, Preem echoed. We spent the next few minutes going precisely nowhere. Evelyn, Nicole, and I were in no state to be standing up and walking in straight lines, let alone climbing the steps to the house or explaining everything that had happened, down there in the dark beneath the earth. Preem wasn't doing too well either, though she wasn't about to fall over any time soon. Rain opened the back door of her car again, so Evelyn could have somewhere to sit. Twill helped Nicole stagger to her feet, though the detective looked punch-drunk, and grumpier than a cat after a cold bath. Twill didn't look too great either, more than a little pale and haggard. I felt my own mind piecing itself back together, but it was painfully slow, eased along by the pressure of Rain's hands on my arms when she started rubbing me like I'd just come in from a snowstorm. Is everyone, I slurred and mumbled, held between her and Sevens. Everyone is fine, Heather, Rain said, staring into my eyes. She held up one hand. Here, open your eyes up proper, okay? How many fingers? 3, I groaned, trying to laugh, delighted by the simple, familiar sight of Rain's chestnut brown hair raked back from her forehead. I'm not concussed, Rain, I'm post-slip. Blame Lozzie. I batted at Rain's hand with a tentacle. She jumped, then laughed. No glasses, not outside. She couldn't see all of me. From inside the back of Rain's car, Evelyn made a sound like she was ordering Preem to execute a war criminal. Her eyes were still scrunched up against the lingering after effects, head bowed with pressure, both hands on her walking stick like an old woman who couldn't find the strength to rise from her chair. For once, even Preem couldn't make sense of her request. The doll demon stared at her own mother with blank-faced incomprehension, more empty-eyed than usual. Kids, Sevens echoed. She was asking about the children. Oh. Amanda said. My boys are fine, yes, thank you. They're right here, Miss Say. Well up there. Jing chose that moment to join us, ducking low through the front door of the house. Her eyes found me with a dark twinkle. Shaman, she rumbled. I managed a nod, though she deserved more for what she'd so obviously done. Jing looked like she'd been having the time of her life. Her lower half was splattered with blood, as if she had kicked a spooky alpaca to death. She had 3 bubble servitors following her like hounds trailing after their master, and an additional, actual, flesh and blood hound in the form of Bernard, Amanda's golden retriever. He was currently doing his good boy best to look fearsome and protective. Zheng was also carrying 2 small boys, one on each shoulder. They clung to her head and neck with both arms like marsupials to a mother. Amanda's boys Richard and Oliver, as I later learned looked about 5 or 6 years old, both of them puff-faced and serious and utterly unafraid of the giant zombie whose shoulders they were riding on. We, said Preem. A man I'd never seen before was doing his best to emulate that lack of fear, following as close to Zheng as he could without cringing in animal terror. Gareth, Amanda's gentleman friend that she'd told us about earlier, had obviously been through quite an ordeal. He was rail-thin in the way of a professional runner, with salt and pepper gray hair and a concerned, intelligent look on his face, framed by a neat little goatee. He was splattered with blood too, though it looked like backsplash from Zheng's violence. A rolling pin shook in one of his hands, held like a club. To the man's credit, he didn't look like he was about to break and run. Everybody was accounted for, quickly enough to still my worried heart and soothe Evelyn's guilty conscience. Rain was practically untouched. She hadn't even needed to use a weapon while trapped inside the spooky nonsense house. Christine Hopton, Twill's mother, was faring similarly, though obviously shaken and upset. She kept her arms tightly crossed, shoulders squared, chin drawn inward. Amanda was none the worse for wear at all, still sporting a bubble servitor on her shoulder like the world's largest and gooeyest parrot. She was also beaming at me. Benjamin, Twill's cousin, the ill-fated and rather useless muscle of the church, had apparently found the shotgun he'd gone searching for earlier, an old-fashioned double-barreled thing with a wooden stock. The gun hung loose in his hands as he guarded his aunts. For all his imposing bulk and carefully shaven head, he looked utterly out of his depth, like he'd seen a ghost. Maybe he had. The bubble servitors slowly oozed out of the house as well, squeezing themselves through the windows and gathering once more on the roof, floating through the air to take up their guard-post positions out in the fields and down the driveway. Bernard the dog watched them go. Amanda hadn't been exaggerating, I realized. He could see numismatic life quite clearly. Lozzie was away with the alpacas, arms entwined with the fence, petting their fluff with both hands. "Who's a good fluffy fluff lad?" she cooed. "Yes, it's you, you big llama, yes. You're like a pillow." "They're alpacas, actually," Twill called to her, but Lozzie didn't seem too worried by the distinction. "Twill, are you okay?" I tried to ask, still hanging on to Sevens and Rain. What I actually said was a slurred mess. It was a miracle Twill understood me. Twill blinked several times, then wiped her mouth on her coat sleeve. I guess. Was hurling real bad when things all snapped back, like. Her body, said Sevens. Purging the parasite. Her unique physiology would be capable of that. When you weren't looking. The parasite is a long story, I said. Sevens is helping. Probably need to compare notes, I sighed. Cringe-Windla is very thankful and very pleased, Amanda said in a floaty informal voice. She turned to gaze at Lozzie. And very impressed. Yes, that's wonderful for him, Christine said, looking somewhat small and reduced, shoulders more hunched and face more pinched than I'd ever seen her before. I didn't blame her. That was her house this little invasion had violated and twisted. I, on the other hand, would prefer a clear explanation for what has just happened. I gather you have all visited our god, somehow. But I don't understand. He is explaining as clearly as he needs to, Amanda replied. Did I detect the tiniest bristle in her words? Christine certainly did, frowning sidelong at her sister. Ben said, clearing his throat and gesturing with the shotgun. Sorry, I'm with Aunt Christine on this one. I'd love to know what the hell that was all about, right? Also maybe get us out of the open and back indoors, in case something else happens. Word, said Rain. Smart man. You want to go back into that? Twill scoffed. He shrugged. It's over, right? I mean, like, that part of it. House is back to normal. Cringe-Windla seems alright. But he doesn't know what else might be lurking, does he? He's not omniscient. We need to get indoors, case something else turns up. And call Mike, call your dad. Twill grimaced, but she nodded along. Ben, Christine tutored his name, one hand forcing the shotgun barrels to point at the ground. I told you to put that back. Stop waving it about. It's not even loaded, Ben grumbled. And I wasn't waving it. Yeah, fair's fair, Rain added. He was keeping it pointed at the ground. Good trigger discipline too, mate. Cheers. I think. Benjamin frowned at her, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but here. He eyed the road and the tree line, clearly on edge, but not for show. I had a gut feeling that the man knew exactly what he was doing when it came to precautions for violence. Everybody shut up and stop talking nonsense, Evelyn rasped in a voice like sandpaper. With superhuman effort she rose to her feet, squinting as if the fading sunlight was too strong for her eyes. Preem offered her arm, Evelyn took it, balanced between doll demon and walking stick. She stomped forward a few paces, so she could address Amanda and Christine directly. Miss Say, Christine said, getting there first, suddenly straightening with the effort of polite regard. I'm very glad to see you are okay as well. This was all so. Christine trailed off, lost for words, shaking her head. Evelyn grunted. You owe me a cup of tea. Christine blinked several times. I'm sorry. Benjamin nodded along. Girls got the right idea. Indoors, cup of tea, wait for the counter-attack or. Christine tutored. Ben, stop, please. Rain pointed at Ben, eyebrows raised in agreement. Muscle nodded to Muscle. You owe me a cup of tea, Evelyn repeated. And some biscuits. Oh of course, Christine said. I'd be happy to, We just met your god and helped deworm him. In the process, I have had to perform some deeply inadvisable magic, to discourage the giant moron from crushing us all to death. Benjamin's face flickered with a scowl when Evelyn said moron, but he kept his peace when Evelyn jabbed at him with her walking stick and squinted like she would poke his eye out. Hey, Evie, said Rain, voice suddenly tight. What do you mean, inadvisable magic? Yes, I added, suddenly worried on a level I hadn't acknowledged until that moment. What does that mean? Evie, are you okay? I'll be fine, Evelyn grunted without looking at either of us. That didn't help, but the conversation was already moving on. It's true, Amanda said. Cringe-Windla is very pleased now. And clean. So clean again. This is good. This is a good thing, we should not be hostile or vindictive. Speak for yourself, Nicole grunted, eyeing Amanda with lingering suspicion. Evelyn said. Which means you owe us all some tea and biscuits, and, she trailed off, frowning at Zheng. Whatever she wants, I suppose. Meat, Preem suggested. Zheng grinned the grin of a deeply satisfied carnivore. The worm has been very thankful. The boys on Zheng's shoulders shared a glance. One of them spoke up, high-pitched with childlike offense. Don't call Mummy a worm. Your mother is a worm, your father is a worm, you are both worms. The boys shared another glance, rather nonplussed. Gareth finally cleared his throat and spoke. He had the voice of a gentle and bookish librarian, not the sort of man who should be tangling with gods and monsters and getting splattered with blood. But then again, I suppose plenty of people would make the same assumption about me. I don't think that's a good thing to be saying to small children, The poor man withered under Zheng's smoldering gaze. Worm, she added. Zheng, don't insult children, please, I croaked. Especially not right now. Can I be a snail instead? Asked the younger boy. Like Hinji. Cringe-Windla, his mother gently corrected him. Evelyn cleared her throat as loudly as she could manage, which unfortunately involved coughing spots of blood onto her own sleeve. Tea, food. Yes. Christine Hopton nodded slowly, still shell-shocked and gathering her wits. I spoke up. What Evie is trying to say, is that we would like to come inside and have a sit-down, and a rest. We've all been through rather a lot. Maybe we can share experiences. Figure out what happened. Clear this up. All that diplomacy stuff. Benjamin nodded at me in silent approval. Yes, Christine said after a moment. Yes, of course. You're all very welcome. We should sit down and, well, I assume the danger is past. Cringe-Windla seemed certain. I nodded. It's over. For now. I think. Assuming none of this was intentional, Evelyn grumbled. Intentional by whom? Christine asked. Her eyes flickered left and right suddenly, as if she would catch the culprit lurking behind a nearby tree. Benjamin sighed out loud, drawing a hand over his face. That's something we should probably discuss, I said. Edward Lilburn, Evelyn said. This is all his doing, his trap, his creation run out of control. Assumption, said Preem. Evelyn snorted. I think it's a bloody safe assumption, she grumbled, then caught herself and shot a guilty grimace at the two little boys perched on Zheng's shoulders. It's a safe assumption. Christine drew herself up and clapped her hands together, putting real effort into reassuming the role of sweet and welcoming older lady, her schoolteacher visage slipping on as certainly as my squid skull mask. Yes, you're all welcome to come inside and have some food. We could all do with a proper explanation. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. My husband will be home soon too, I'll call him right away, yes. We can get this all cleared up. I hope. Lozzie looked back over her shoulder while still petting the alpaca. Jan's gonna be wondering where I am. Nicole sighed heavily. Can somebody please go check on my dog? Evelyn raised her walking stick and pointed at the smashed lump of gray meat, the dead parasite on the ground. Before we go anywhere, that needs to be burned. Right now. Ben, if you please. Christine said. Benjamin Hopton sighed and shrugged. On it. For a moment he seemed to share a look with Evelyn, one of understanding that went deeper than muscle and mage. Apparently we weren't the only ones used to disposing of evidence. Almost 2 full hours after our return from the inside of Cringe-Windla's shell, I couldn't stand the way his cultists looked at me. They tried not to be obvious about it, but they couldn't conceal it completely. We were all sitting in the Hoptons' dining room, in the rear of Gearswin farmhouse, gathered around the large wooden table covered in decades of chips and scratches. The fireplace lay cold and unlit, but the heating from the kitchen kept the room comfortable in the early summer evening. Mugs of now cold tea sat atop the table, along with plates of biscuit crumbs and the remains of 2 sandwiches, the evidence that we'd been breaking bread with the church, well into the growing dusk. It was all very domestic, very normal, very human. Except for the topics of conversation. "These glasses are a miracle," said Twill's father. Michael Hopton held Evelyn's modified 3D glasses up to the back doors looking out onto the patio, handling them like an exposed circuit board. He peered through them again, at the bubble servitor perched on the nearest fence, bathed in dying sunlight. "Just magic," said Evelyn. "We've never been able to make anything like this. Even the old man." Christine Hopton cleared her throat, loudly but politely. Michael caught himself and grimaced under his wife's sidelong look. So much like Twill, I thought. She really did take after her father. Even my late father-in-law, he corrected himself, Clive. Rain interrupted from our side of the table, unable to keep the smirk off her face. "'Excuse me, sorry," she added with a wink when everyone looked at her. "Just, big shot intimidating cult wizard guy, but he was called Clive. Kinda undercuts him a bit, No offense meant, though. Very normal name." Christine looked none too pleased at the mockery. The old man had been her father, after all. She pursed her lips, but she was too polite to complain. Amanda shrugged, still fuzzy-eyed, bubble servitor still perched on her shoulder as she sat in her chair. Michael worried at his lower lip. Twill growled. "He wasn't intim. But I got there first." "He wasn't intimidating," I blurted out. "He was more like you than you realize, Rain." Rain turned a smirk on me without missing a beat. "You're saying I'm not intimidating?" I sighed and rolled my eyes. "You know what I mean." Rain laughed and nodded a silent apology to the Hoptons, raising her hands in surrender before taking a long sip from her tea. Twill huffed, putting up with the implied insult for now. But Amanda and Christine were both staring at me in muted awe. I looked away, seeking Rain's hand under the table. I tightened my clutch of tentacles around the chair I was sitting in, gripping tighter and tighter. Maybe if I gripped hard enough, I might splinter the wood. As I was saying, Michael Hopton resumed, making a show of peering through the glasses again. "Even old Clive, rest his soul, couldn't have made something like these glasses, Miss Say. Even with all the contacts he had, all the things he did achieve, the second sight was beyond him. Beyond any of us." He lowered the glasses and nodded respectfully across the dining room table, at Evelyn, though he couldn't resist a little flicker at me too, like a tiny petition to some aloof idol in the corner of the room. "I am very glad that we are not in conflict with each other any longer." Evelyn stared back, half squinting, curled in her chair as if her back hurt more than usual. At any other time, I would have read her attitude as hostility, but we all knew how exhausted she felt. She let the implied question hang in the air. She grunted eventually, then looked at Amanda. "I know you have numismatic sight. How is that beyond you?" "So does the hound," Jing rumbled from behind us, from her more comfortable seat on the sofa, sprawled out like a tiger at rest. She was still chewing her way through the dried rabbit meat that Gareth had found in the fridge. She raised one hand and pointed at Amanda's dog. Bernard looked up at the sound of Zheng's voice, panting at her with approval. I'd never known an animal to approve of her before. He was sitting very calm and comfortable on the little rug by the back door right next to Marmite, who he'd apparently decided was a member of his pack now. Of the dog and the huge squid spider thing, Marmite was the one who looked slightly unsure, still half-wrapped in his shadowy membranes. Bernard was perfectly happy, panting softly with his tongue out, watching us humans and other than humans talk ourselves out. At least the dog wasn't looking at me like I'd descended from the heavens. "Ha, yes," Evelyn added. "Thank you for that information, Jing. A dog seeing spirits. I can only imagine how that works out." "Very well, actually," Amanda answered, voice floating away as she spoke. "He's kept my boys safe." "Good boy," Preem said to Bernard, from where she stood at Evelyn's elbow. Bernard looked up at her and tilted his head sideways, ears flopping about. "Yes, but how?" Evelyn grunted, wincing harder as if fighting off a sudden spike of headache. "Rather contradicts all this praise for my magic eyeglasses if you can just," she waved a hand vaguely, gesturing at her own head. Michael shared an awkward look with Amanda, turning the glasses over in his hands. "Being God-touched is not enough to grant the sight," he said. "Yes," Christine spoke up. She was sitting very straight-backed and formal in her own chair, trying to appear calm and in control. She'd spoken very little compared with her sister and her husband, more shaken by these events than I'd suspected at first. And constantly distracted by me, of course. My sister's position is special, yet she went through a very different experience, in her communion with our God. Please understand, this is not a normal thing for us. We do not all see beyond the veil. We are not gifted, not as. Christine met my eyes. She tried a smile, a warm, welcoming smile, but the sweetness was soured by worship. "It's not a gift," I said. I tried to sound normal, but I couldn't keep the disgust out of my tone. "Of course," she hurried to add. "Of course, my dear, I apologize." "There's no need to say sorry," I added, feeling horribly awkward. Evelyn just stared at that exchange, exhausted down to her bones. "Still doesn't explain the dog," she grumbled. "I asked for a dog," Amanda said. "I prayed and pleaded. A dog, to see with me. When I was little. Cringe-Windla has always honored the request. Bernard is the most recent of my friends to have the sight. There were others before him, all passed away in their own time." "Ah," Nicole said from her place on the other sofa. "You know, that's almost enough to make me forgive you for threatening to hollow my skull out." Amanda nodded to the detective, as if this was a perfectly normal thing to say. A dull pang of jealousy gnawed at the roots of my heart. If only I'd had a dog as a companion all these years, a spirit-seeing canine friend who could understand. "Cringe-Windla has never extended that favor," Michael explained. He reached across the table to return the glasses. Rain accepted them in Evelyn's stead. "Those glasses are a miracle, I mean it, really. Having something like that, even one or two pairs of them, it would seriously improve our safety and security." He swallowed. "The security of the church, I mean. The safety of my family." Christine sighed and closed her eyes briefly. "Mike, you can be so indirect sometimes." Christine sighed again, sharper. "Twill, please. Stop with the foul language. Not in this house." "Thank you for the inclusion," Evelyn grumbled. "Weirdos," said Preem. Michael hopped and huffed and looked away, exactly like Twill would do when challenged like this. It was a bit different coming from a man built like a compact lumberjack, with a face like a granite outcrop, radiating physical readiness. But he and his daughter shared the same total inability to conceal their emotions. He was terribly embarrassed by all this. "I'm trying to be polite here," he said to the mug at his elbow. "These people have just saved us." "Heather saved you," Evelyn hissed. "As I have already explained." "Language, dear, please," said Twill's mother, tone turned hopeless. "My point is," Twill went on, "if we want copies of the glasses, we can just ask. Evie, hey, can you make more of those glasses? In theory. Can we have some?" Evelyn turned a look on Twill, more plain tired than grumpy. Twill pulled a, "obviously I am asking a rhetorical question," face. Evelyn sighed and turned back to Michael, Christine, and Amanda, the current ruling triumvirate of the Church of Hringwindla. For just a moment, instead of keeping their attention on the grumpy mage in their midst, all three glanced at me. As if I was the power behind the throne. I couldn't stand it. I wanted to put my squid skull mask on and hiss at them to leave me alone. The awestruck behavior had started earlier, when we'd sat down and explained everything that had just happened, matching our experiences and putting all the pieces together. We'd had official meetings with the church twice before, once when Christine Hopton had visited Evelyn's house in Sherrowford, to offer Hringwindla's help with the gateway spell, then a second time when they joined the fraught and dangerous détente between us and Edward Lilburn, though that second time had not included either tea or biscuits. But this time was different. We'd just been through an ordeal together for a certain value of together, and had come out the other side with a very different perception of who these people were and what exactly they worshipped. And they'd come out of it with a completely different perception of me as well. Gearswin Farmhouse was entirely back to normal. On the inside, the walls stood sensibly upright, the doors led to where one expected them to go, and the view through the back patio windows was of dying sunlight, overgrown fields, and the shadow-haunted forest. Wind dragged through the trees outdoors, sounding the leaves in a slow, all-pervasive rustle. The long shadows crept across the farm, past the sheep and the pair of alpacas huddled outside, and over the roof of the house, covering the dozens of bubble servitors keeping watch up there, in case Edward Lilburn should decide to make a move. But it was a natural darkness, long welcome after the cartoonish fears of Hringwindla's nightmare. It was hard to believe that giant shell lay buried underground, only a short walk away. As we all talked, I kept staring out of the window, thinking about that pressurized bubble of outside, here on Earth. Some things that sleep in English soil should never be disturbed. At first, Christine and Amanda had done their best to show real hospitality, helped by Gareth and helped by the boys once Shing had put them down. We had cups of tea all round, plenty of snacks, and an offer of painkillers for Evelyn. "Thank you, but I have my own," Evelyn had grumbled. She had accepted a glass of water to wash down the pills she'd produced from inside a coat pocket. "Mind if I have one?" Nicole had asked from the sofa. Sure." Preem had to take a pill to the detective, because Evelyn didn't want to stand up again. I wasn't sure if she could stand up right then. Evie really was faring the worst of any of us. At first I wasn't sure how much of it was the after effect of the slip, and how much was the price of her magic. The crackling, electric blue shield she'd created earlier, down there in Hringwindla's guts, was by far the most pyrotechnically impressive piece of magecraft I'd ever seen from her. Real, physical, tangible magic, with a twist of her hands. And she'd done it to protect us, to protect me. I told her so, as we'd gotten settled in waiting for the kettle to boil. "I thought you said magic was never fireballs and broomsticks." "Evie, that was incredible," I'd murmured to her, squeezing her hand beneath the table. "It was stupid and costly," she'd grunted back, then coughed more crimson into a borrowed handkerchief. Preem picked up her glass of water and put it down 6 inches closer. Evelyn obeyed, taking a sip to wash away the taste of her own blood. But where Nicole and I slowly recovered from Lozzie's overenthusiastic slip, Evelyn did not. As we and the Hoptons talked, she hunched in her chair like a gargoyle, dark-eyed and clutching her walking stick. I stayed close. At one point I even wrapped a tentacle around her wrist, which unfortunately made her flinch. She couldn't see that part of me without the glasses. But after the flinch, she hung on tight. Her bone wand lay on the table before her throughout the entire conversation, like a loaded rifle. I wasn't sure what that meant. I even toyed with the idea of asking her to put it away, as a show of good faith. But then the Hoptons started looking at me like I was an outsider god, and I was thankful for the shelter of an implicit threat. The rest of us weren't doing too badly. Nicole sat on the other sofa, first nursing a mug of tea, then a glass of beer. It wasn't as if she was going to operate a vehicle any time soon. Somebody would have to go with her to recover her car, but not today, not after all this. She was still lucid and speaking clearly, her parasite very much dead, but she looked shell-shocked and exhausted and said very little. She looked how I felt. Zheng had put the boys down, much to their pouting disappointment. She had also consented to have several towels spread out on the sofa so she didn't smear the cushions with blood. "Llama," she said when I asked, grinning with satisfaction. "They're alpacas," I sighed. "And I don't think you actually killed one. It was a nightmare thing, a piece of living fiction, a ghost, sort of." She chuckled, placed one huge hand on my head, and purred so deep it made my entrails vibrate. "Ghosts don't bleed." The Hoptons looked far more shaken, but none of them were actually hurt. Twill's father turned up about half an hour after we'd returned, racing home after his wife had called him. Their home had been invaded, their god violated, their physical safety threatened, and they were powerless to do anything about it themselves, except wave useless shotguns around and hope the bubble servitors would help. Benjamin was relieved of said shotgun by Twill's father, gently but firmly. Once it was clear the threat was past, Ben sulked off home himself. I gathered he had a life of his own, things to do, places to be, despite his dutiful bodyguard work. Gareth, Amanda's gentleman friend, seemed eager to get out from under our feet, or perhaps just happy to get away from Zheng. He excused himself by saying he needed to go upstairs and change his blood-stained trousers, then spent most of his time shepherding the boys out of the dining room and pottering about in the kitchen. I got the impression he was on the periphery of the cult, not privy to the inner workings of the leadership, even if he was sleeping with one of them. In fact, Michael, Christine, and Amanda all seemed to engage in a wordless agreement not to begin discussing any serious details until the two boys were upstairs, Benjamin was off in his car, and Gareth was firmly out of the room. But then came some awkward deliberation over Twill's presence. "She's an adult now, Chris," her father had said. "She's our daughter, and she's involved. She's got a right to be involved. She is not part of the decision-making process." Christine had huffed. "Michael, you know this, you know the rules. We make the rules." "Yes, and they exclude her." "Language." "Cringe-Windla doesn't have an opinion on this," Amanda added from one side. The other two ignored her. "She's my daughter, and she's staying." Michael crossed his arms, trying to look stern, but the man almost flinched under the grey wrath of his wife's piercing stare. "Either we stick to the rules, or we." But Evelyn had cleared her throat and banged her tea mug on the table. The Hoptons all looked at her instead, though Amanda had spared a glance for my twitching tentacles. She could still see them. "Twill is with me," Evelyn grumbled. "If she has to leave the room, then I go too, and everyone else comes with me." Her exhausted stare dared any to argue. Twill stayed, but didn't say much, looking intensely awkward. Lozzie and Sevens did not stay, however. As soon as it was clear we weren't going to light up or play video games, Lozzie vanished literally, just vanished when nobody was looking. I was worried for about 10 minutes, until she reappeared on the sofa and started gushing to Nicole about how cute her dog was. Husky. Husky husky. Hucky. Huxy. Not a husky, actually, Nicole had said, still squinting over a mug of tea. He's some kind of cross. Husky, German Shepherd, something. He was a stray. Husky. And he's watered and fed and given many pets. Please please Nicky, please, can I go see him again? I won't even call you a pig, please. Sure. Fine. Knock yourself out, you little goblin. But Lozzie did not zoom through time and space to go spend the rest of the evening with Nicole's dog, partly because I requested she stay close after that. None of us wanted to risk Edward Lilburn making a move amid all this. We were exhausted as it was. But Lozzie wasn't sticking around to listen to all this serious talk. She declared she hadn't been here for any of this, had little to add, and went to find Amanda's boys to see if they wanted anything. The Hoptons watched her go, somewhat awkward and unreadable. I didn't understand why they looked at her as if she was on another plane of existence. To them, she was just some random teenage girl, wasn't she? Just another friend of Evelyn and Twill. We called home before we got down to business. Rain called Kimberly, to check that the house had not burned down and nobody had started doing anything more dangerous than cannabis. I had half a mind to speak with Kimberly myself, to request a word with Jan, and to put Tenny on so I could hear the comfort of her familiar, trilling voice. But I was so exhausted by this long day that I just sat there with Evelyn, and let Rain handle the details. 7 Shades of Proper and Prim followed Lozzie upstairs as well, but she stayed in the dining room long enough to confirm her earlier assessment the parasites were all dead. That's why you were vomiting so badly, little puppy, she said to Twill. Puppy? Twill spat. Hey. And you still haven't explained this parasite thing. I still don't understand where they all went, Nicole said. I cleared my throat. I think I can explain that, but only because I've watched too many marine life videos on YouTube. Certain parasites secrete anti-competition chemicals or hormones, to kill smaller members of their own species that might compete for hosts or resources. I think the big one inside Hringewindla killed off all the others, when it got too big. Just a natural consequence. I'm sorry, Michael said. Big one, inside Hringewindla. I am going to need a serious explanation, please. I already told you, Amanda said. I told you all. Michael and Christine both suppressed pained winces. Clearly, Amanda was not very good at relating direct communication from their god. We all shared what had happened to us, right back to the moment Hringewindla's nightmare had begun to isolate us from one another, leaving us to wander inside the suddenly expanding labyrinth of the farmhouse. We even drew up a basic timeline of events so we were all on the same page. Michael Hopton handled that, playing secretary for the rest of us with a pad and pencil, as the only one who hadn't been here in person. Everyone except me had experienced a true maze, doors opening on hallways and rooms that shouldn't exist, blood-grinning mutant sheep peering in through the windows. When I dropped down out of the window, Rain explained, you were just gone, Heather. I took my eyes off you for a second. Scared the hell out of me. Me too, I admitted. Eyes, yes, Evelyn muttered, thinking out loud. Heather saw what others didn't. She was the only one it didn't work on. She saw through it. But why would that be? Christine asked. You've mentioned that Heather here has unique powers, yes. But Hringewindla, he is a god. How could any mortal have avoided his thoughts? It's complicated, I said. What nobody understood was how Zheng had broken the rules of the maze, other than people bumping into me. Rain, Amanda, and Nicole. She was the only one who had apparently been able to gather others to her. Bernard the dog, then the boys, then Gareth, like she was a magnet for protection in the false darkness. Maybe it's because she kicked one of the fake alpacas to pieces. Rain suggested. You didn't burst through a wall, did you? Evelyn asked. Oh yeah, Preem deadpanned. Evelyn frowned up at her. Zheng rumbled from the sofa. No gods and no masters can keep me bound, she said. The shaman's blessing frees me forever. Even from your worm filth. She directed those last few words at the Hoptons. Christine bristled, but Amanda reached out and placed a hand on her sister's arm. Zheng, Amanda said. Thank you. Again, thank you, for looking after my boys. I think they have become fond of you. Shut up, worm, Zheng rumbled. Amanda quivered. It was not for you. Things became more complicated when we tried to explain how I had escaped, let alone the nature of the parasites, how we had removed them, and why I was immune. At first the Hoptons asked a lot of questions about every assumption we made, but all 3 of them grew quieter and quieter as Evelyn and I explained what details we thought were safe to share. I made a silent and private executive decision not to explain 7 Shades of Sunlight. As far as the human members of the church were concerned, she was just another magically inclined friend of Evelyn, say, the local mage of note. I was too emotionally exhausted to realize the impact of my own actions. There were too many things to address, too many things to think about: the fallout of the duel between Rain and Zheng, the nature of Seven's terrifying and beautiful new form, the words Evelyn had spoken down inside Hringwindla's shell, not to even mention the possible involvement of Edward Lilburn in all this. But I was wiped out, everyone was wiped out. All I wanted to do was stop thinking for a week. So we just told them. We told them that we went to talk to their god and journeyed into his shell. We told them that I woke him up by force, spoke to him inside my own mind, and cast him out when I was done. The nightmare had indeed broken as soon as we'd woken up Hringwindla. According to everyone we'd left behind in the house, the transition had been a sensory kaleidoscope of collapsing walls and melting doors, the nightmare sloughing off like shed snakeskin, depositing them back into the heady and raw textures of the real. They hadn't known what to make of it at the time, though Rain and Twill had deduced it quickly enough when they'd realized who was missing. That was when the awe started. Christine, Michael, and even Amanda, they all started to look at me with shell-shocked reverence, with the kind of eyes that Badger had turned on me after he'd seen me defeat Urinju. I was worried they would look upon me as a profane interruption, as an outsider who had insulted and bullied their god. Though the very idea that I could bully a god was rather worrying in the first place. But what happened was far worse. They stopped asking questions. Michael and Christine kept looking at Amanda, as if for confirmation of what I was telling them. She nodded, floaty and numb, as Hringwindla's distant communication matched up with my own. All I did was speak with him, I said, struggling to look them in the eyes as they watched me. It wasn't difficult. Well, okay, no, that's a lie, it was difficult, but it wasn't I sighed and looked away. He's just an outsider. He spoke to you, directly? Christine asked me. Her voice quivered. And then you made him leave? Yes. Sort of. Lozzie encouraged him to leave. None of them knew what to say. The little one is a marvel of creation, Amanda said after a moment, voice a heavy mumble. Christine and Michael both turned to look at her, half alarmed. Evelyn perked up too, frowning hard. But Hringwindla had nothing more to say. Little one. That was the same way Sevens always referred to Lozzie. Was Hringwindla talking about her, or about me? From then onward, they did not look at me as a human being again. I couldn't stand it. You did deworm him, Christine said, clearing her throat delicately. And without that, we would all have been trapped. You have rendered an invaluable service to us, and to Hringwindla. You took his blessing and then left it. For this, I thank you. She bowed her head. Her husband did the same. I shrugged, feeling deeply awkward, hands around my mug of tea. The shaman dispenses her own blessings, Zheng rumbled. Hey, Rain added. That's that. Heather does that by herself. No need for a higher power. Michael snorted. Christine frowned at him sidelong. Amanda nodded, the only one who understood how Hringwindla himself really felt, or so I assumed. The bubble servitor on her shoulder seemed to agree, bobbing up and down. In a misguided effort to renormalize myself in their eyes, I told them about Hringwindla's gift. The soapstone coin was still in my pocket, weighing as heavy as a fragment of neutron star. But I was completely wrong, this was not the right move. I passed it across the table and Michael accepted it with both hands, like it was the relic of a saint. He bowed his head and couldn't look me in the eyes. There was much ooing and ing over the coin as they passed it from hand to hand. TCH, Evelyn tooted. You do understand that object might be dangerous, yes? How could it be of danger? Michael said in a hushed voice, holding the coin up to the light so he could inspect the strange 5-dot design on the top, or was it the underside? Hringwindla gave it to human hands. He trailed off, flicking a worried glance in my direction. Zheng snorted. The shaman is no monkey. What burns your hands may not burn hers.
Ah, he said, blinking in frozen alarm, like he was holding a piece of radioactive meteorite. Yes, yeah, Heather is protected against a lot of crap, Rain said. She nodded at the soapstone coin. Let us know if your skin peels off in a couple of days, yeah. Michael shared a sudden and worried glance with his wife. Oh, I'm sure it's fine, she said. I'm joking. Rain laughed. It is only stone, Amanda said. That seemed to settle the worries. But still, from his hand directly. When Michael passed it back to me, he averted his eyes from my gaze. He handed me the stone like he was making an offering to a dangerous god at some dark and forgotten shrine. I decided to ignore it as best I could. I didn't want to start a fresh argument with the church, with Twill's family, not when we'd finally reached some kind of understanding at last. Even Evelyn was being diplomatic. But after Evelyn shared the modified 3D glasses, Michael and Christine both stared at my tentacles like I was a hidden revelation. And then after they handed the glasses back and made their request, they looked at me for the answer, not at Evelyn. I snapped. Stop it. I blurted out. I think Evelyn had been about to answer them seriously, because she half flinched and frowned at me as I scraped my chair back and stood up. My cheeks were burning and my tentacles flared out. I couldn't stop it happening, couldn't stop the hiss clawing up my throat. Heather. Rain said my name. Whoa, what? Twill was up on her feet too, panicking at my sudden anger. Bernard let out a soft woof, which made Marmite flinch. Preem tried to place a hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged her off. Stop looking at me like that. I snapped at Hringewindla's cultists. All three of them stared at me, suddenly ashamed and shocked, but more awed than put off. I am not like your god. It was just an old man in my head. He's in all of yours, isn't he? Isn't he? Shocked silence. A gentle hand took my wrist. This time I allowed it. Rain, holding me softly. The Hoptons all looked at each other. Amanda just bit her lip and shook her head. Michael and Christine looked exactly like shepherds being shouted at by a biblically accurate angel, afraid to express their fear. Twill groaned and put her face in both hands. I think she swore under her breath. It was just an old man in my head. It's not like that for us, Michael said, averting his eyes from mine. You spoke with him. As an equal. I am a 20-year-old university student with tentacles, I said, trying very hard to keep my voice steady. My cheeks burned and a hiccup forced itself up my throat. I am not an outsider god. Stop looking at me like that. You rejected him, Christine said, shaking her head, as if this explained anything. How can you're on his scale, his. Hey, Rain said, trying to lighten the moment with her tone. She pointed a jokey finger gun at the Hoptons. Stop looking at my girl like that, yeah? She says stop, so stop. I'm the only one allowed to ogle her, alright? Zheng purred from the sofa. How can they help themselves, little wolf? They are right. The shaman is more than flesh. Reformation, said Preem. She's just a kid, Nicole added, but her tone gave away that she didn't really believe. She'd already been awed by what I was and what I could do. I started to turn away from the table, peeling my tentacles off the chair, itching to go upstairs and find Lozzie. I did not want to be looked at like this. I was a thing of the abyss, a creature of the oceanic darkness between the spheres, but I was not a god, not a thing to be worshipped. I sniffed and hid my face, pulling Rain with me. Wait, Evelyn grunted. Wait a second. We're so sorry, Christine hurried to say. Try to see this from our perspective. I'm so sorry we've caused offense, but nothing like this has ever happened before. We don't. Shut up, Evelyn said. Listen. Seeing as we have met your god, I would like to propose a formal cessation to any hostility between us. Any suspicions? We're allied against the same man, the same one responsible for all of this. I would like to make this explicit, before you lot go off and have a religious crisis without Heather here, thank you very much. Evie, oh Evie. My heart hurt. Of course, Michael said, pulling himself up. But this Lilburn man, we still don't know where he is. Was this a move against us? Evelyn shrugged. I don't think so. I think it was an accident. But I also think we now know where he is. I turned back, as surprised as everybody else. Evie. A thin, deeply satisfied smile creased Evelyn's exhausted face. She gestured at Nicole. Why did the parasite scramble Nicole's short-term memory? Any takers? Nicole sighed. Because I must have subconsciously figured out where Edward Lilburn's house is, right? We've been over this. I don't remember anything. It's like I had the worst drunken night possible, but without the fun part. You may not remember, but your feet do. Twill lit up first, getting it before anybody else. Shit. Twill, her mother tooted. Why did Nicole end up here? Evelyn asked. I heard that familiar old tone in her voice, the aloof professor, waiting for a slow class to catch up. Why did she walk all the way here while under the influence of the parasite? What are you saying? I figured out where the house is, and went to it, on foot. Exactly, detective. Evelyn nodded to herself. It's just a theory, but I think the parasite didn't walk you here. You walked here. You figured out where Edward Lilburn's house is and set off to find it, which triggered the parasite to begin gestating. By the time you reached it on foot, the parasite was fully grown, to knock you off course and make you forget. Then why'd I end up here? She asked. You're a professional detective. You're also a very special kind of paranoid idiot. I should know, because I'm one too. You're telling us that you never looked into any of us, after our difficult first meeting, months ago? Ah. Nicole cringed. I mean, yeah, I did. Just to confirm you weren't all using fake names or something. And you looked up Twill's address. Nicole cleared her throat and scratched the back of her head. So what? It was lodged in my subconscious. Yes. With the parasite scrambling your mind and your ability to walk, you made for the nearest place you knew you could somehow get into contact with us. So, sometime between the moment you stepped out of that graveyard in Manchester, and when you stepped out of the woods and onto this farm, you found Edward Lilburn's safe house, somewhere between there and here. Or close enough. Which means we know where it is, we know where he's hiding, because it has to be somewhere you could have reached, on foot, within the window of time you went missing. That's our Evie, Rain said into the stunned silence. Got a theory for everything. Theory of everything, said Preem. Evelyn's smile got thinner and darker. She was so very pleased with her hypothesis. I hope you're right, Nicole said, sounding very skeptical. What do we need to figure this out then, a map? Of course it's right, Evelyn grunted. But she didn't look at Nicole for approval. She allowed her eyes to creep and flitter upward, searching for my face. She was so tired, so drained, lips still stained with a little of her own blood. Evelyn looked at me with more love and worship than a legion of cultists. And nobody else could see that. Good idea, I managed to say, staring back at her in surprise. Good idea, Evie. I think you might be right. She nodded and looked away again. Of course I'm right. Now, let's figure out how to hunt a mage.